Please use the receivers in front of you. The Korean channel is 1, English channel 2. Before we start with the opening ceremony, I'd like to inform you that today's event will be streamed online and will be held here offline. Good afternoon, everyone. Today we'll begin the international seminar co-organized by Hanyang University, Chungju City, and Friedrich Naumann Foundation, the Balanced Regional Development Plan, Decentralization and Revitalization of Local Economy. So Chungju is a city, it's a wonderful city, and I'm very delighted to meet you all here. I am Professor Chae Young-eun at Hanyang University, and I would like to hand over to Dr. Han Sang-woo for the opening remarks.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are here at Chungju City, and we are here at the international seminar co-hosted by the Graduate School of Public Policy of Hanyang University and Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom and the city of Chungju. It's a great pleasure to host this international seminar. In 1991, Korea's local autonomy was revived for the first time in 30 years, and 30 years has passed since then. In order to implement a full local autonomy, we still have some way to go. We have many challenges ahead of us. What is fortunate is that now, decentralization and revitalizing local economy is recognized as the driving force behind driving up the nation's competitiveness. This awareness has spread, and that is why we are holding this international seminar in the city of Chungju. We are joined by Mayor of Chungju City, Mr. Cho Ki-ryong, and also Professor An Sung-ho, and we will also be joined by 3 speakers from abroad. They are Robert Franke, Director of the Office of Economic Development of the City of Dresden, and also Mr. Mark Boven-Schulte, who is Head of Department, Demography, Clusters, and Foresight of the Institute for Innovation and Technology. And we will also be joined by Robert Neff, former chairman of Liberal Institute. I would like to thank the speakers for joining us. And we will also be joined by discussants who are academics and also who are city officials who are working in the field. In particular, I would like to thank Mr. Park Hae-soo, who is a city councilor of the Chungju City Council. And I would also like to thank Mr. Baek Han-gi and Hong Sung-yong, who are city officials who work on the ground. I would also like to thank Professor Kim Tae-jin of the Korean National University of Transportation, and also Professor Shin Won-chul of Hanyang University, and Kim Oh-kwon, the manager of the Economy and Enterprises Division of Chungju City. Since 1987, for 34 years, the Hanyang University and Friedrich Naumann Foundation have collaborated in many events, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Christian Talks, head of the FNF Korea, for your cooperation. Due to COVID, we were not able to invite as many participants as we would like, but I would like to thank the city officials and also the citizens of Chungju City who have made it out here today to this offline event. And I would also like to join our online participants who are joining us via YouTube. I understand that we are joined by participants all across Korea, and I would like to thank you for your participation as well. And we are also joined by alumni from the Graduate School of Public Policy of Hanyang University and the Center of Local Autonomy. I would like to thank you all for your participation.
Thank you. Next, we have Christian Talks, the head of Friedrich Naumann Foundation. He will give his welcoming remarks.
Well, thank you very much for this warm welcome, Professor Han. Dear Mayor Cho Gil-young, dear Director Han Sang-woo, dear speakers and participants to our international seminar, be here at the UNESCO International Center of Martial Arts in Chungju City or through online. I would like to warmly welcome you to join us today. The Friedrich Naumann Foundation and the Center for Local Autonomy at Hanyang University have been jointly organizing seminars on various issues related to local autonomy for 34 years. But it is the first time that we host our program in Chungju City, a city known for having full potentials to development and striving to become a place where even the smallest voices of citizens are treasured. It is our true pleasure to be here. Thank you, Mayor Cho Gil-young, for having us today in your beautiful city. Some of you may be familiar with what the Friedrich Naumann Foundation, FNF, stands for, but please allow me to briefly introduce what we are doing for those who do not know. The Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom is a German civic education organization. It was established in 1958 to offer civic education programs based on liberal ideas, including individual freedom and responsibility, the market economy, the rule of law, and human rights. We opened our Korea office in 1987, 34 years back, together with the Center for Local Autonomy at Hanyang University. We have been promoting decentralization and citizens' participation by organizing many educational programs such as conferences, workshops, study tours, and training courses for local government officials and local politicians. This year marks the 30th anniversary of reintroducing elections for local councillors. Over the 3 decades, we witness a continuous development of Korean local autonomy, successfully achieving its essential missions such as political decentralization, the administrative division of responsibilities, and citizen participation. The journey to further decentralization has been challenging, but the Friedrich Naumann Foundation is very proud of being part of it with our joint efforts with the Center for Local Autonomy. The CLA is our most long-standing and trustful partner, and I am very grateful to Professor Han Sang-woo for co-organizing today's seminar and the excellent cooperation between our 2 institutions. I always love to point out that in the university, at Hanyang University, we are wall-to-wall neighbors with our offices, so we meet rather frequently by accident or deliberately. And actually, we were founded together in 1987, and I think this is much more than a professional partnership. It's a constellation where friendship grows out of. In the era of the 4th Industrial Revolution, why are we still talking about the local autonomy? It is because local autonomy has always been an essential and decisive factor if we want to achieve and sustainably safeguard individual freedom as well as freedom of society. It is because local governments know best their economic needs and conditions to fully tap on their potential for growth. It is because the governments closer to their citizens can provide the most relevant and effective services to their people. And it is because citizens can more easily and participate in the process of decision-making at local level than national level. We tend to talk about the 4th Industrial Revolution and smart cities mostly from a global or national level, but these trendy buzzwords should be approached particularly from a local angle. It is because the Industry 4.0 and Smart City can be most up-to-date tools for local governments in achieving their regional economic development, which will lead to overall national development. In this sense, decentralized system will act as a new engine for national development as well. Today, we will assess the current Korean local autonomy and share cases from Germany and Switzerland on decentralization and regional economic policies. I wish us all exciting and inspiring 4 hours and look forward to our further activities, hoping to see you all in person in one of our following seminars. Please feel cordially invited. Today already we will overcome this COVID thing one day, soon I hope. Thank you very much for your kind attention. 감사합니다.
감사합니다. 다음은 조길형 충주시장님의 이번 세미나의 기조 발표가 있겠습니다.
네, 조기령 충주시장입니다. 지방자치 부활 30주년을 보내면서 오늘 우리 충주시에서 독일 프리드리히 나우만 재단, 또 한양대학교와 분권과 지역경제 활성화에 관한 국제 세미나를 개최하게 된 것을
On decentralization and revitalization of the local economy. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Christian Talks of Friedrich Naumann Foundation and Director Hanyang of the Center for Local Economy of Hanyang University. I would also like to thank Professor An Sung-ho of Daejeon University. I would like to thank you on behalf of the citizens of Chungju City. I would also like to thank and welcome the citizens of Chungju and also our foreign speakers who will be delivering presentations from Germany. I would also like to welcome our Korean experts who are visiting the city of Chungju, especially Mr. Park Hae-soo and also Mr. Kim Tae-jin and also Mr. Baek Han-gi. So I would like to welcome all of you and also thank all of you for being here. As you know, Korea's local autonomy was suspended in 1961 and it was readopted 30 years later in 1991, and already 30 years have passed since then. Local autonomy has brought many changes and development, not only to the way the city is run and managed, but also to the daily lives of the citizens of Chungju. Administrators have worked to serve the citizens of the city and have been effective in carrying out policies that are tailored to this region. From the citizens' side, they have been able to benefit and enjoy friendly public services that are faster and more transparent. Furthermore, now the city council is filled by members elected by the citizens via direct elections. The mayor is also elected. In short, we have more citizen participation, and thus city administration is carried out in a more democratic manner. The citizens engage in discussions with the city government on regional development issues, taking part in local governance, resolving local issues through cooperation and creating synergy. However, many local governments in Korea, including the city of Chungju, have yet to secure sufficient authority and financial resources to carry out its tasks. Local autonomy can be fully realized when sufficient authority is devolved from the central to the local. With the implementation of local autonomy, local governments have seen expenses rise, in particular with welfare costs. Against this backdrop, it is imperative that sufficient finances be transferred to local governments. Local finances should be sufficient in terms of size, and autonomy should be guaranteed in terms of its use. The theme of this seminar is decentralization and revitalization of the local economy. For the local government to revitalize the economy, it must be granted sufficient authority and resources to carry out necessary programs autonomously. The central and local governments have worked hard for decentralization. However, despite the efforts, we have not yet realized full and sufficient decentralization. Today, I would like to talk about two ways to revitalize the local economy by local governments. First is the need to improve local finance schemes. Local finance is imperative for the local government to fulfill its task and ultimately to realize local autonomy. So I believe that local finance and local autonomy go hand in hand. So in fact, the advance of one promotes the development of the other. They are mutually dependent. Therefore, I think a common challenge for all of us is to secure financial autonomy of local governments, which serves as a foundation for realizing local autonomy. As a specific proposal, I believe we must secure a way to allocate tax bases in a diverse manner. In order to alleviate the imbalance in sources, we must restructure tax items from special metropolitan and provincial areas and break it down further to include the lower levels of government. In redistributing tax items, we must look to enhance the autonomy and flexibility of local finances and seek to promote balance between local governments, especially among municipal governments. To that end, broad and balanced tax bases must first be allocated to local governments in an effort to ease the financial gap. At the same time, national taxes must be devolved to local taxes to enhance and maximize the autonomy in local finance. Second, in providing financial support, the central government must recognize the autonomy of local governments. The core of decentralization is to improve the efficiency of resource allocation through a mechanism of autonomy and responsibility. This means that the autonomy of local government should be recognized as much as possible so that autonomous choices are possible. As for bearing the responsibility, I think that it is necessary to prepare an institutional device that allows local governments to be accountable. Third, we urge the reasonable improvement of the local fiscal adjustment scheme or the local finance equalization scheme. In general, since local government's own income base is weak, various regional development projects implemented by local governments, especially investment projects, depend heavily on the support of different ministries under the central government. And oftentimes the positions of the central and regional governments are bound to come into conflict. Therefore, when it comes to the local finance equalization scheme, it is necessary to develop an integrated model so that the effect of fiscal transfer can be maximized at the local government level. Next, I will briefly address the issue of the expansion of local autonomy. The control of the central government is permeated throughout local administration, but one of the most obvious areas is the right to organization and the right to personnel management. The will of the central government is at work in everything from the establishment of local government offices to departmental organization to appointment and promotion of officials and personnel exchange. Although the Local Autonomy Act specifies the ordinance delegation of administrative organization in quorums, the actual and direct regulation is being implemented through presidential decrees, enforcement ordinance, and rules. Competition between nations is accelerating if local administration is implemented simply according to a given framework and cannot serve as a place for innovation and experimentation, then it will be difficult to achieve regional development, let alone national development. Self-governing administration must have the ability to respond sensitively to the demands and changes on the ground nearest to the people. This, in turn, means that there is a need for diverse and flexible organization and manpower. I hope that the discussions at today's seminar will make a good contribution to firmly establishing local autonomy in Korea. Thank you.
With this, we will conclude the opening ceremony and we will continue the first session with our moderator as Director Han Sang-woo.
the opening remarks a short while
이름으로
ago.
마이크 테스트하고 있습니다.
I'm actually testing the mic right now.
국제 학술 세미나다 보니까 좀 분위기는
This is an international seminar,
우리가 2시
and I think that we can relax a bit. We will finish around 5:40.
발표 내용도 재밌게 좀 들으시고 편안한
You have
마음으로
come all this way, so I hope you can enjoy the presentations and make yourselves at home. Most of you are with the city or are with the university. The subject at hand is not that easy, but I'm sure that it is a topic that you're interested in. So for the next 4 hours, I hope that you find this seminar interesting, and I hope that you also take active participation, asking questions and engaging in discussions.
잘 아시다시피 아마 발언을 헤드 테이블에 계신 분들은 카메라 계속
As
잡지만
you know, the people here on the stage will be highlighted with the camera. The camera will be on them.
기록으로 남습니다.
So we will be on record on YouTube, I guess, indefinitely. Have we begun? Should I begin?
네, 그럼 지금부터
Ladies and gentlemen, we will now begin the first session in this international seminar on decentralization and revitalization of the local economy. We have 2 papers to be presented during this session. I will be giving each presenter 30 minutes for their presentations. First, we will invite Honorable Professor An Sung-ho for his presentation. He will be talking about the situation in Korea. I will be giving him 30 minutes. Next, we will be joined by a speaker from Germany. We have 2 German speakers and 1 Swiss speaker in total, but in this session, we will be joined by 1 German speaker. I will be giving him 30 minutes as well. We are joined by 6 discussants as well, and we have 30 minutes for the discussion. So I will be giving each discussant about 3 minutes for their comments.
방청석에 계신 분들
And if time allows, we will open the floor for questions and comments as well. And I encourage those of you here and online joining us to join us in the discussions.
발표를 해주실
So now
안성호
I would
대전대학교
like to
명예교수님이신데요.
introduce Professor An
아마
Sung-ho.
지방자치를 전공하시는 분들은
If you
우리나라에
have majored in local autonomy, you probably know Professor An Sung-ho. He is a renowned professor in terms of theory and academics, so he is a renowned professor in the academia and the political circle. And he was the vice president of Daejeon University, and he's now professor emeritus. And today he'll give a presentation on strong democracy, constitutional reform, decentralization, and bicameral constitutional reform. And the second presentation will be delivered by the director of the city of Dresden, and he will be giving the case examples of Dresden on regional economic revitalization. So I have given the introduction of the speakers in the order of the list in the program. The first discussant is Manager Kim Ok-won, and the second discussant is Professor Kim Tae-jin of Korea National University of Transportation. And third, Professor Shin Won-chol at Hanyang University, who teaches local autonomy. Next, we have a city councilor. He came on behalf of Chungju City Council, Mr. Park Hae-soo. He designs Chungju city policies. Next, we have a member from the Chungju Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Secretary General Park Hang-gi. Thank you for your time. And we also have a discussant from the Seoul Council, and he is known for safeguarding Dokdo. He participated in the civil movement of safeguarding Dokdo. So maybe you'd like to mention what you do during our discussion session. We have City Councilor Kong Sol-young from Seoul.
그러면 안성호 교수님.
So I'd like to invite Professor An Sung-ho to deliver his presentation.
네, 네.
Should I go up the podium? Yes.
이 귀중한 자리에
Thank you for inviting me in this wonderful event.
우리 대한민국이 선진국에 진입
In the Korea actually became an advanced nation.
우리가 원한 것을 적극적으로 원한 것은 아니지만
It's not something that we
올려줬습니다.
actively pursued, but we did manage to become officially an advanced nation, and our economic size is close to the top 10.
그런데 많은 사회 지표,
But many social indicators, including the quality of life, compared to other OECD nations, we rank on the bottom of the list.
그 가장 중요한 원인이
And I think the biggest reason behind this is the quality of Korea's constitutional order. I believe that the quality of our constitutional order is low.
오늘 제가 말씀드릴 것은
So in my presentation today,
올려야
I would like to argue that we need to increase the quality of our constitution in order to promote further growth of Korea and also make better daily lives for our citizens. And I think that's how Korea can become a country that can lead the world.
하고 있는 민주주의를 저는
And I would like to say that the democracy of Korea today is a thin, a weak democracy, and we need to transform this into a strong democracy which requires constitutional reform. And the nature of strong democracy
지방 분권을 포함한
is based on decentralization. So we need to talk about decentralization and the legislative process of central government, and also talk about territorial representation, which will be given by building a upper house in our legislature.
이 헌법 질서와 국가 발전에 대해서는
When we look at the constitutional order and national development, many academics, many scholars have conducted studies over time.
이 몽테스키의
And one of the well-known academics is Montesquieu, and he wrote a book on greatness of the Romans and their decline. When the Roman monarchy transitioned into a Roman republic, that led to the rise of Rome. And when the Roman Republic turned to the Roman Empire, it led to the fall of Rome. That's the main point in his book. In 2012,
전 경제학자 또 정치학자
developmental economist and politician Asmaglu and Robinson wrote a book called Why Nations Fail. They have studied for about 15 years jointly, and they found out something remarkable. It's that inclusive political institutions are what makes countries prosper, and extractive ones make countries fail.
대표적인 사례로
And one of the representative example would be the comparison between North Korea and South Korea. I'm sure you already know that the human rights in North Korea does not exist. And their GDP is only 1 out of 54th compared to South Korea. It's among the lowest around the world. So the correlation between the constitution and national development was
많은 사상가, 연구자들에 의해
studied by not just Plato, but many great thinkers and social scientists over time.
공개된 비밀이다.
So I would say that this is a disclosed secret.
이 민주주의와 품질과 정책 성과에 대한
And next,
있습니다만
there are many studies conducted on the quality of democracy and policy performance. And the Korea Institute of Public Administration conducted a study with the OECD throughout the past 2 or 3 years, and we came up with a state inclusiveness index. And it turns out that policy performance and the quality of democracy is very closely related. So the more inclusive a country is, the more innovative that country is, and higher the performance of their policies. The study was conducted on 36 OECD member countries, and the countries with strong democracies, there were about 10 of them, and they were Switzerland and Nordic countries, and also Germany. So these countries, we can group them as countries with strong democracy. They're very inclusive countries. And the rest, even though they are democratic nations, their inclusiveness is really low, so their democracy is weak. US came in 14th, and Korea 31st. So the inclusiveness, especially the political inclusiveness of these countries, are really low. Many people say that Korea is already a democratized country. What else do we need? And that's somewhat true, but I would like to say that there are many problems in our democracy. I can't say that our democracy is that strong. We cannot remain complacent. The candlelight demonstrations, which took place between 2016 and 2017, the former Chief of Defense Security Command tried to declare the martial law and mobilize the army to suppress the protesters. And the prosecutors were investigating this former Chief of Defense Security Command, and he fled to the U.S. But for some reason, he was not caught. And Benjamin Barber, who's a politician, warns, we may be born free, but we die free only when we work at it in the interval between. So the low quality of democracy of Korea leads to many barriers to national development. Low quality democracy causes excessive struggle for political power among different parties, and we see political polarization, which leads to divide in the public opinion. And we also see the phenomenon of judicialization of politics and politicization of judiciary. As for the general public, they are not acting as the sovereign actors. They are just mere bystanders. So this low quality democracy causes political distrust and unstable state affairs, and it setbacks in the development. Recently, we are faced with global issues. You can see that globally, many democracies are being threatened. And we see other problems such as climate change, environmental degradation, the pandemic, depleting resources, exacerbation of inequality. And all of these problems are threatening free democracy. So a weak democracy, if we let it be as is, it can facilitate centralization and not decentralization. And Tocqueville in the U.S. warned this in the past. Even a federalist nation, the U.S., has seen a great amount of political centralization. And even in Germany, we're seeing some trend of centralization, but thanks to the reforms in the Basic Act in 2006, they were able to amend their decentralization rules. On the other hand, Switzerland, although it's a same federalist nation, it does not have a severe problem of centralization. The reason is that Switzerland has direct democracy, which prevents centralization in the first place.
강한 민주주의의 대표적인 나라로
So the representative countries of strong democracy are Switzerland and Nordic countries. If you look at these countries, we can say that all of their outcomes are a miracle. Their World Happiness Index, Corruption Perception Index, and Social Progress Index are all at the very high level. They're global leaders, and trust in government, as for Germany, it's 85%, so which makes them the first. And in Nordic countries, it's about 65%. So they're at the upper tier. However, in Korea, that is 45%, and that's the increased level of trust in government. And the GDP per capita in Swiss is $84,000 and $61,000 in Nordic countries, and for Korea, it's about $33,000. And the government debt, the OECD average surpasses 100%, but Switzerland and Nordic countries, you can see that it's around 41, 42%. And unemployment rate in Switzerland is 2.9% and 5.2% in Nordic countries. So it's much lower than the OECD average figure. So they're really countries that are well off, and their poverty rate is the lowest in the world. So that's why we call them countries that are well off and wealthy. So strong democracy promotes high policy performance according to many studies. Many empirical studies have been conducted since the Second World War. Decentralization studies, consensus democracy studies, and direct democracy studies have been conducted, and all of these studies indicate that when these types of democracy increase, the policy performance also increases. So I would like to group the constitutional order into two types. The first will be imperialist order, the empire order, and the other one at the end of the spectrum will be the republican order. So I name them as imperial order and republic order. In the imperial order, it's based on power over others. They're trying to influence others, whereas in republic order, you are sharing power with others. It's not. So imperial order is based on a hierarchical order, which is vertical, whereas republican order is a horizontal order of power. And at KIPA, we conducted a study on this, and I tried to summarize the results in this slide with an image. The constitutional order is closer to an imperial order, going to the left, and to the right, it's closer to the republic order. And somewhere in between the two ends of the spectrum, there are three types of schemes. One is the authoritarian system, such as China or North Korea. And right in the middle, many countries fall in this group. And I like to say many countries around the world still fall under the authoritarian regime. And then when we say that we do have democracy, we say that there are free elections. But there are democracies with low quality, including Korea. And I also think that U.S. is also part of a weak democratic country, because political conflicts keep happening, whereas Switzerland and Nordic countries with high inclusiveness are countries with strong democracies, and they have politics based on public discourse. So moving forward, I believe that Korea should consider this when reforming their constitution so that we may become a strong democracy in the future.
자, 그런데 제국의 질서는 인간을
But when we look at the imperial order, I think that it makes people to lose their humanity, and that's been proved by many studies, like the Stanford prison experiment study by Philip Zimbardo, and
예루살렘의 아이히만의
and also the trials
아렌트가
of war criminals such as Eichmann. Hannah Arendt saw the trials and said that situations make people become more evil, and she named this banality of evil. So I would like to say that imperial order tends to make people to become more evil.
공화국 질서
On the other hand,
를 바꾸면
if we change our constitution to become more like a republican order, it can boost patriotism. Many great thinkers have pointed this out, like Machiavelli, Rousseau, and a German thinker pointed out that constitutional patriotism is important. And others, like Tocqueville, have also mentioned the same.
강한 민주주의 쪽으로 옮기게 되면은
When we go towards to become a strong democracy, the people who live in that nation become more humane and good.
헬브룩이라고 하는 역사학자가
And a historian called Stephen Holbrook said that Switzerland was able to fend off Germany during the Second World War
결과는
based on a study.
스위스
They were able to do so
선도치 국방의 비결은 스위스가
thanks to their ironclad defense,
전민주제
because they had a federalist system and direct democracy, and it's a federal country. That was his conclusion to why Switzerland was able to fend off Germany.
가지고 있는데
And
뭐가 문제가 있다는 것이냐?
the flaws of the Korean constitution is as follows. I believe there are 3 flaws. The first is that we have winner-takes-all system. It's a majoritarian democracy, which leads to mudslinging and
더불어서
confrontational politics. Also, the relationship between the local and the central government is that the power is mostly skewed to the central government. So the local governments are really dependent on the central government. That's the second problem. And third, we talk about representative democracy. Korea has a representative democracy which leads elites to dominate the country. So even if the majority of the public wants something, it's not going to happen unless the elites decide to change this. The only way the public can change this is by taking to the streets. That's the current system of weak democracy in Korea. We need to change the current constitution. How should we change it? The first is that the winner-takes-all system should be transformed into a consensus democracy. By doing so, we can divide the power among the majority and minority. Also, secondly, the excessive centralization of power should be decentralized so that the central and local governments and grassroots movement bodies can share power appropriately. And third, the elite-dominated representative democracy should be transformed into a semi-direct democracy, just like Switzerland, so that the elites do not make a decision that goes against the citizens. And if they do so, we need to have a method which allows the citizens to prevent such trials. In Switzerland, there are 2% of direct democracy. And that 2% changed the entire political system of Switzerland, making the citizens to be the owners of their country. It has become a true republican state. So then let's look into detail as to how we can reform the constitution. We need to first protect the minority. We have an imperial presidency, which should be changed into something similar to the Germany's political system. which has a presidency and a parliamentary system. So the president only plays the role of the head of the country, and the parliament takes the overall operation of the country. And we need to strengthen the proportional representation of the lower house and also establish an upper house with territorial representation. And to distribute power among central and regional governments, I believe that we need to introduce a federal system. First, we need to ensure fiscal autonomy of local governments by changing the tax article in our constitution so that the financial relations and taxing authorities distributed to local governments. And lastly, instead of having the National Assembly decide all the lawmaking process, we need to change the system so that the local governments can also participate in the legislative process. So we have a big population in Korea, and we need a similar change as that of advanced countries. Lastly, the power should be distributed between the elites and citizens through introducing the direct democracy. So, for instance, public participation in the constitution and legislative process should be introduced, and we should also have national referendum. So out of the many tasks for reforming our constitution, I believe that having a bicameral legislature is very important because we've been working on decentralization over time, and we built a committee right under the president's office to promote decentralization. However, true decentralization did not happen in Korea. Rather, many criticisms are made that Korea is very centralized. So, since we have become an advanced nation, we need to change our system so that we have a strong decentralized system which allows balanced regional developments. And local governments should be able to represent their regions by having an upper house in our legislature. In fact, Korea had an upper house in the past. We have a 9-month experience, and bicameralism was stipulated in our constitution for more than 10 years. But during the military coup in May 16th, 1961, it was scrapped from the constitution and it hasn't been put back in place. The fact that we don't have an upper house is a strange phenomenon. If you look at G7 states, they're all bicameral. And of the top 15 countries in terms of GDP, only China and Korea are unicameral. However, China has a pseudo upper house called Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference. So Korea is the only country that does not have an upper house with territorial representation. And of the OECD member states with a population of 1.2 million and over, only Turkey and Korea have unicameral legislatures. And as you know, Turkey is a country with various conflicts and tensions in the world. And in Korea, we see many social conflicts as well. So I think there are two grounds for having an upper chamber in Korea. The first is that the general public comprises people of heterogeneous groups of people. And this cannot be easily reconciled through a unicameral system. We should acknowledge this and try to address the problem through structural change. And that solution is introducing an upper house. And I think with that, we can promote national integration and resolve multiple conflicts. And even if we do unify with North Korea, such upper house will help. So we need to build an upper house in our legislature. And the distrust in our National Assembly is really high. We have low quality of legislation. To resolve that problem, we need to have a house which reflects and reconsiders which should be the upper house.
이렇게 함으로써 우리가 원하는 지방 분권 개혁
And by having an upper house, we can promote balanced national development and also boost the quality of legislation and also the trust in the National Assembly.
시간이 없기 때문에
So I'm running short in time, so I'll try to keep my comments short.
상원을 만들자 하는 것입니다.
But my main argument is that we need to have an upper house of territorial representation. But many people might say, why do we need more lawmakers?
300명은
But the 300 members of the lawmakers is not that many if you consider the OECD average.
지금 현재 300명의
So what I suggest is that we add 50 more upper house members and the current 300 lawmakers today. And as for the budget, I think we can maintain the current amount of budget to support these extra 50 upper house members. So then you might ask, how can we manage to do so? Currently in the National Assembly, each lawmaker has
6명만 줄여도
8 chief advisors. And if we decrease that number to 6, we don't need extra budget. We can use the budget we have to support extra 50 upper house members. And I'll skip the details on this slide.
자, 그다음에 강한 민주주의 헌법 개혁을
And to
우리가 그러면
ensure constitutional reform which will promote strong democracy, I'd like to say that there have been trials in the past in Korea in this direction. However, it did not work out. For instance, in 2018, the president tried to reform the constitution, but the largest opposition party was against this, so it did not work out. And we introduced the quasi-proportional representation 2 years ago, which led to the increase of satellite parties, and this in turn actually reduced the positions of minority parties. And last year, the National Assembly proposed the public participation in constitutional process system, but this bill was also lapsed. So the constitutional reform is something that's really difficult to achieve. So I say that it's a narrow gate towards constitutional reform.
원래 이 헌법 개혁은 사실은 혁명적인 변화가 있을 때 대개 일어납니다.
Usually, constitutional reforms takes place if there's a revolution or if there are struggles for power. And that's why the establishment does not like to give up on their power. So I do think, realistically speaking, changing the entire constitution will be difficult. But what we can do is that our general public should acknowledge this problem. About 70% of the general public agrees to constitutional reform, but if we ask them and if we go into detail, nobody really knows what this is about. So they don't have much knowledge in this area. And that's why they can't pressure the political circle to change the constitution. So we need to enlighten our citizens so that they may pressure the elites to make changes. And the elites should give up their established power and they should become servant-type leaders, just like our late Dosan. He tried to build a true democratic republic through his Daegongism. He was a servant-type leader, and our political circle today should all become the servant leaders. Thank you for listening.
네, 안성호 교수님,
Thank you very much, Professor An Song-ho.
발표 감사합니다. 이어서 두
Next,
번째
I would like to invite
주제
our next presenter.
발표가 있겠습니다. 두 번째 주제는 지역
The
경제
next
활성화
presentation is
정책의
titled
Dresden
Regional
사례를
Economic Revitalization
현재
Policies,
드레스덴
Case
시에
of
계시는
Dresden. The speaker is Robert Franke, who is the director of the Office of Economic Development of the city of Dresden. He joins us
발표를 해주시겠습니다.
via Zoom.
So, good afternoon, everybody. I hope I can be understood and sharing my desk is working properly. I would like to thank Professor Sang Won Han for the nice introduction and especially the organizers, so Christian Task, for giving the opportunity to having exchange opportunities, even though we are in not that easy times. So unfortunately, I cannot join the conference in person. The networking opportunities will not be there. So let's hope that Corona is going to be vanishing quite soon so we can have a real exchange soon. Over the years, we have been in close contact to Korea from the municipality level, from the city of Dresden, and that has always been highly beneficial to us. So we have heard that the system in Germany is quite different from the system in Korea about sharing resources and distribution functions from the federal level, and then we have federal states and myself representing the municipality, the city level. That will be more or less the focus of a talk given by a colleague from the German side in session number 2. I would like to add what we have achieved from the city level, adding a more, I would say, economic focus. I am in charge of the Economic Development Office of the city of Dresden, and what we have done here will be part of my presentation, but please always keep in mind that the success that we have seen over the years has always been an effect of cooperation between the different levels, the federal level, so the central government and the level of the federal states, but also strong engagement from the cities. So, and as you see, the subtitle has to do with innovation, driving regional development and economic growth. So our strategic approach is really put innovation in the center of our activities in order to provide economic development. And this economic development then again creates resources for the city's household, because we derive then income, tax income, etc., where we can then put infrastructure projects in city roads, in days care for children, schools, etc. But there always has to be a strong economy, and here we try to put the right framework conditions to achieve this. So, as I told you, for us it's very important to drive innovation. The base for this is creating a very competitive research landscape. And that is what we have achieved over the past decades. As you can see, there's a technical university, and this technical university, Dresden, has been the club of the so-called excellence universities in Germany. That means extra resources from the federal level, so we can really be front at the research agenda on the university level in Germany. But besides that, Dresden holds more than 10 Fraunhofer institutes. So Fraunhofer strength is extraordinary here. There's no other city in Germany, there's no other city around the world which has more than 10 Fraunhofer institutes. But besides that, there is many more research partners in our ecosystem that creates, we would say, a world-class research landscape. And on that basis, we believe that we can really deliver solutions and services to the changing world. And there's some areas, some industries where we believe we can take opportunity for our economic growth, but also deliver solutions to help other cities, to help other areas around Germany, but also in the world in bringing forward their digitalization activities to really improve their city structures. We also look a lot into Industry 4.0 in order to name a few of these aspects that we try to approach by really putting a high intense pressure on innovation aspects. I think coming from a city level, it's very important to have a strategy in mind where you can really create a strong push and focus on a development. And on the right-hand side of my slide, you can see our strategic approach. There is 3 columns. One column hardware, second column software, third is connectivity. We say that Dresden has these 3 competitive strengths where we put a lot of public resources in order to maintain this competitive strengths and even accelerate the development of these 3 columns. Because we believe if you are front runner in these 3 technology fields, you can combine these competences and create platforms to deliver solutions to various industries. And in the first part of my talk, I would like to give you a little detail on how we try to push forward hardware, software, and connectivity, so strengthens our basis. And then in the second part of my talk, I would like to show you a few examples on how we deliver these solutions into our own smart city development issues, but also how we develop energy projects and then also cooperate with automotive. Because in this industry, there's a lot of disruption, and we believe here we can derive a lot of economic strengths and economic development for our region. So, but let me first of all look in these 3 columns, these major competitive strengths. Software is the fastest growing industry in Dresden and the region around us. So it's very important to maintain that. And in order, though, we believe it's not important to have achieved a certain research landscape, but still
Mr.
further
Franke?
invest in that. It's
Sorry
okay?
sorry for interruption.
I hear a comment. Is the presentation working well?
Yeah, we cannot see your presentation report. So could you show us your PPT?
Is it working now?
Not yet. Yeah, yes. Thank you.
Sorry for that. Okay, so I was taking you through the
You're welcome.
presentation. Let me give you a 1-minute summary. I told you that we have a strong research system. There's the slide to that. It's really competitive because of all the different research institutes combining this research landscape, which has a world-class ranking. Then my second issue was delivering solutions in various industries that see a high disruption. And third is the strategy I was addressing, that hardware, software, and connectivity is combining competitive strengths to deliver solutions on various industries. And now I was coming to that we really put a lot of attention to improving our columns, hardware, software, and connectivity by, for example, launching a new software institute. Looking into the connectivity column, here you can see that this plays also a major focus. You can see that the connectivity issue has brought a 5G lab to our city. It's not just the 5G lab Dresden, but it's the 5G lab Germany. It's combining 500 researchers working on new communication technologies. And as you can see on the right lower corner, there is a lot of industry demand on these 500 researchers' work. And these companies pay money in order to really address their needs to research agendas. So, and as you can see, it's not only mobile communication companies like Vodafone, Telecom, etc., but it's also companies coming from the semiconductor industry. It's companies like like BMW and Volkswagen that's coming from the automotive sector that are really interesting to see how 5G and then in the next steps 6G can help them to get their communication technologies done. I told you a little bit on software, I told you a little bit on connectivity, but hardware is the third column as I introduced you on the short strategic slide. Strengthen hardware competencies is what we have been working on for more than 20 years, and you can see there has been a very competitive ecosystem. Basically, it's the largest semiconductor site in Europe. There's large companies like Infineon and Global Foundries, and lately also Bosch, that have been running some of the most modern fabs around the world. But as you can see, there's also a large number of small and medium-sized enterprises that push forward innovation competencies in this area. And all this bringing together the entire value chain in microelectronics. So coming back, that there is not something that you can achieve, but you always have to build on it. It's a very tremendous success that Bosch has decided to strengthen this ecosystem by putting up their new semiconductor fab in Dresden. Bosch, being the world's leading automotive supplier, has been deciding between Singapore, upstate New York, and Dresden on bringing their next fab on the agenda. And we were very happy that we could achieve this investment in our ecosystem, which on one hand will create additional economic growth, but on the other hand could show that our existing ecosystem is very attractive to additional investments. So, and this has been also quoted by other late developments in our city. Infineon has been working on a new development center in our city. Vodafone has decided to bring their R&D research center to Dresden. That has been announced in May 2021, so just a few months back. And as I told you, Bosch has made a decision, and the fab opening ceremony has just been in June this year. What's important to point out for us is it's not only the biggest investment in Bosch's history, but as you know that a shortage in chip production has been very crucial at these days. It has been a tremendous success that the start of production could be a half a year faster than it has initially been planned. What does that mean? First of all, tremendous Bosch management to start production half a year early, but it's also a very big success for us as authorities, as we had to provide all necessary paperwork and get all processes done, including providing water, energy supply earlier than actually planned. So in interest of time, I will skip over this slide. We're now coming to the second part. So far, I have addressed that we work hard on putting competitive strengths on hardware, software, and connectivity. And now I would like to address a few outcomes on automotive industry and also smart city issues, as we believe that we can combine these issues quite well. Why is that? There's a lot happening right now, especially electromobility is coming fast to our city. It's coming fast to the market. And from the city's perspective, it's always not that easy to see how fast trends are arriving and what necessary steps are needed to be done in order to be ready to introduce new technologies. And as I told you, we do try to be upfront in modern technology development. We always try to think on how can we achieve high pace. And here you see an example that we try to partner with industry as they are front runners. We believe that sharing resources, sharing inputs, sharing ideas, we can speed up the development in certain areas by just combining these strengths. And the example of Volkswagen in the city of Dresden has been very important for us. We agreed to look on 4 different issues where we can join forces. Sure, it's innovation, so joint research lab activities. It also has to do with rolling out these new technologies into our city. It has to do also with education. So this is the Future Mobility Campus concept, but it also has to do with startups. So how can you bring new ideas into an area like Volkswagen, which is a huge company, but can really take advantage of the ideas that are out there from the startup environment. And just briefly to look over this, what effects can be created on a regional level. It is the Center of Future Mobility that has been brought by Volkswagen to our city. So it was very important to see that electromobility can also create value in our city by just adding these new technologies into the production area that we have in our city. But we have also looked into various projects without going too much into detail. Sure, we had to look into charging, into parking, navigation, and sharing issues, as these are very important issues of a changing world of mobility. But what can a city do in order to bring forward that development? Sure, it's setting up of public charging infrastructure, as there is a lot of new EVs arriving on the market nowadays. It's important to have charging infrastructures, because without charging infrastructure, there's not going to be any EV in the city environment, because it's just not possible to have a convenient mobility function. So here you can see a short slide on how we really adopted the trends that are out there. First of all, in 2016, we started a cooperation with Volkswagen, and we set up a track, which can shown be by the scenario Volkswagen Corporation 2016, where we decided we will ramp the number of local charging points will be 250 by 2025. 1 year later, and 3 years later, in 2019, we just saw that the development of the electromobility is much faster. We decided we also have to speed up. And you can see we decided to come up with a second scenario where we just continued our cooperation and said in 2025, we need to have 400. And then again, 1 year later, in 2020, we just started again to see that the development is even much faster by the electromobility. And so nowadays, we do see the scenario that by the end of next year, we will have 400 charging points in the city of Dresden. So to be honest, we are quite proud that as public authorities, we were able to increase speed and really preparing the opportunity that the depletion of this new technology within our city becomes available by providing charging infrastructure and also being a very valuable partner in the cooperation with Volkswagen. So we have addressed mobility hubs, as we see that there is a very changing demand. Not everybody has its own car, but there has to be a lot of focus on multi-mobility, where you can change from public transport to a bike. You can also have a car sharing issue. So various different modes of transport at one point, and we introduced these so-called Mobi stations. And we believe that also the charging infrastructure is a crucial element at these charging points. And when we started this project, it was like the first such station in 2018. And by now you see a certain network all over the city, where also the charging infrastructure is widely spread over all our city area. So overall, we believe Dresden has become a lighthouse for e-mobility by this cooperation. We are very happy that it had to do also with changing economic aspects, since Volkswagen brought a Center of Future Mobility and a software development center to our area that created very interesting jobs and also addresses our software competencies, which I told you earlier, which are very important for us. We work very closely together with startups, so startups being very crucial, again, for innovation speed. The city of Dresden has then stepwise started electrification of our own fleet. We have done a lot of investments in public charging infrastructure, as I told you. The new mobility hubs are also part of micromobility, e-car sharing, etc., and which is also very important, set up certain incentives in order to create awareness and also increase the attractiveness for our citizens by, for example, free parking for e-vehicles for 2 hours. So within the cooperation, we were not only looking on to EVs, but also on how can we slightly develop an infrastructural system where highly automated driving might be possible and available within our city. And you can see on the right-hand side, there's various dotted lines which indicate the test corridors within the city where automated driving projects has been carried out and the infrastructure has been put up respectively. Which is important. It's important to point out that this is not only true for cars, but on the lower part of my slide, you can see a tram system, which also provides information to the tram. For example, the doors will close in 8 seconds, and if you go by 40 kilometers per hour, you will just hit the green wave. That just avoids a lot of acceleration and deceleration procedures, so it's good for environmental reasons, but will also help you to increase the traveling speed. So in our pilot projects, we were able to reduce the loop time for one tram line by 5 minutes, and that helped us to just save one tram on the entire track, which just is also a business case opportunity for our public transport provider. So bringing economic reasons together with economic and environmental reasons is just the main goal that we look into. And here's one example where we believe that worked. So what else a city has to do in order to provide development goals? I told you startup incubation program between the city and Volkswagen is one nice example. But if you create such startups, it's also important to provide then certain infrastructure when these startups are growing. In the first instance, there is not a lot of budget these startups have to spend, and therefore we provide startup ecosystems, sufficient space. So over the years, there has been a lot of startup facilities put up by the city of Dresden in order to provide small budget space for startups. And when they start to be grosser, when they start to become much bigger, then it's important to provide industrial real estate. And there's one example I would like to show you on this slide. So providing real estate is highly important if you want to welcome more investment from outside or if your companies are growing. So that's why we also look very detailed on this issue. And here you can see our latest project. It's again showing interaction between R&D institutes and industry. The red circle highlights the areas where 4 Fraunhofer institutes are located. So there's a strong R&D strength in this area. And then around this, there is space for industry to settle down. And then by these short distances, we do see a lot of synergies which help to really improve and fasten innovation speed so that the ideas from Fraunhofer can then be transferred into companies and they can then provide solutions technical wise and services to the market. So last but not least, since I'm running out of time, I would also highlight that international cooperation has been always important for us from a city level. So over the years, we have been traveling back and forth to Korea a lot, since we believe that these innovation aspects that are important for us are also very important for Korea. And so we always have seen a high match, and we always benefited from the exchange and on the economic sector. And one or two examples I would like to highlight. Overall, we have, for example, hosted the ADECO conference. The first time it had been outside of Korea, and now back then we signed a memorandum of understanding with Chongwon City, and out of that we were able to start a cooperation between the Korean and Germany Materials Center, which is held by KIMS Technical University of Dresden and one of our Fraunhofer institutes. And so you can see signing ceremony. Signing ceremony is something which is really nice to have, but really bringing that onto the road and then have joint research projects, it's the next step that is beneficial for both sides. Second example for Korean cooperation with the city of Dresden is Samsung's investment in Novalet. Why is that interesting to see? It's just because Novalet has been one of these startups, let's say 10 years back. It has been a spin-off of the Excellence Technical University of the city of Dresden by creating organic materials which can then be put into light emitting diodes and then put into the smartphones and TVs. And Samsung had made an investment and now again created a headquarter for its company here in Dresden. So with that, I would like to summarize my short introduction in Dresden, in the Dresden case. I hope I could show you that putting a lot of effort on innovation will bring back a lot of benefits to the regional area, to the regional level. Today, we have numerous global companies located their innovation center in Dresden. Some latest examples starting in 2018 I have put on this slide, and you can see Infineon, Volkswagen, SAP, Bosch, Jenoptik, Vodafone, Amazon is quite interesting and highlighting names. And so I would say we are on a pretty good track. We do have a strategy. I told you hardware, software, and connectivity is what we try to develop, where we'll try to allocate a lot of public resources. And with that, then also together in cooperation with industry, we try to deliver solutions to the market and also bring these new solutions into our city. So it's both ways. Here I have shown you one example, the cooperation between the city of Dresden and Volkswagen. Overall, I think we are very well on the way regarding our mission, bringing future technologies to cities around the world, and on the other side, benefit by economic growth, and so really drive regional development. So with that, I would like to finish my talk and hope I could just really bring some insights from our latest developments. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your nice presentation, Mr. Robert Franke. Mr. Robert Franke, are you in your office in City Hall now? Dear Mr. Franke? 오케이. 자, 우리 토론 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 한 3분 정도씩 이렇게.
I'll give 3 minutes for all the discussants to give comments or questions. We heard 2 presentations. One was about decentralization, and the second was about practical economic revitalization. The 2 are different topics, but if you do have any comments or questions, please feel free to give them. And I think Director Franke is also listening to our discussion. So if you have questions for him, give him a question. So I'd like to invite Manager Kim Ok-won of Economy and Enterprise Division of Chungju City to speak up first. Thank you for inviting me to this wonderful event. Because I'm in charge of our city's economy, I see that the COVID-19 is impacting not just Korea, but the entire world. many people are struggling. So to promote regional economic development, we are trying to come up with many policies. I wonder what Germany is doing in their side to help promote their economy among COVID-19.
다음은 김태진 교수님.
Next, Professor Kim Tae-jin. Good afternoon. As introduced, I'm Kim Tae-jin of the Korean National University of Transportation. I would like to thank the two presenters, Professor An Sung-ho and Director Robert Franke, for your presentation.
And when it comes to Professor An Sung-ho's presentation, you talked about we have to transform into a strong democracy and we need to reform the constitution. And you mentioned that we need to build a upper house, and you gave grounds that we need to protect the minorities by building a representative upper house, and we need to give taxing authority to the local governments, and we also need to introduce a little bit more direct democracy in our system. So you concluded by saying that the citizens need to be enlightened for us to actually implement all of these changes, and the leaders of our countries need to become servant-type leaders. So it was a really valuable comment. But how can our general public become enlightened, and how can these leaders become servant-like? Because it's not something we can demand them to become. So I do believe that there needs to be realistic solutions to promote such enlightenment.
As for Mr. Robert Franke, you talked about the strategies to revitalize the regional economy of Dresden City. You gave us many examples of such efforts. I think that your presentation will contribute to the economic development of the city of Chungju, where this seminar is being held. I have two questions for you. The first question is, you seem to be emphasizing innovation in your presentation. You talked about how the city of Dresden is focusing on economic competitiveness and technologies that will be needed in the fourth industrial revolution, and you seem to be very much ahead. I would like to ask how it is that Dresden has come about to select these four areas as a strategic approach. My second question is, you talked about Bosch and Volkswagen and your cooperation with Dresden City. I would like to ask how you managed to attract these companies to Dresden. What kind of incentives did you offer these companies for them to be in Dresden?
Next, Professor Shin Won-chul of Hanyang University, please give a comment or question. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I am Shin Won-chul, professor at Hanyang University. So I'd like to touch upon the first presentation, the strong democracy, and we talked about decentralization and constitutional reform, and the Korean government has not been that active in this field. And I do believe that we have many problems in this field. And you mentioned that it's important for us to decentralize for balanced national development, and giving taxing authorities to local governments can increase the fiscal autonomy of local governments. But you can see that the fiscal autonomy of these local governments are decreasing over time. And Professor An, do you have any realistic detailed plans as to how we can give these taxing authorities to the local governments?
In the second presentation by Mr. Franke, we listened to the example of Dresden. In fact, the population of Dresden is not that large. I think it's about 500,000. And you talked about the research centers and TUD and how there are research centers for basic sciences and applied sciences. And for a city that is not that large, I think that Dresden's case is impressive, and I think we really need to learn a lot from Dresden. I think maybe we can think about the Sejong city. The Sejong city is supposed to be a city of education and science, but what is the issue with the city is that the companies are not part of the picture, and the culture is not part of the picture. So I think we need to benchmark Dresden in how they incorporate the companies and the culture. And so I have three questions, I guess. How is it that a small city like Dresden could grow into a city like this? I'm curious how you attracted the companies in the first place. And I would also like to know how the government is supporting the cities in Dresden. And lastly, if you were to give any advice for Korean cities to revitalize their economies, what would your advice be? So those are my three questions.
Professor Shin-Won-chol, your question was to Dr. Franke, right? Yes, it's. So, Dr. Franke, I'm sure you're listening to the questions.
Yes, I was listening to all the comments. Thank you very much for the interesting comments and questions. I just made a few notes, and I hope I will not forget to answer any of these questions. In case it's going to happen, please feel free to come up with the questions again. So first of all, it's correct. Dresden is a city of 500,000 inhabitants. So population-wise, it's not that large. That's correct. So the achievement to have such a strong innovation system with the R&D institutes, fundamental research, and also applied research is something which is quite unique. That's correct. So over the years, it has been fruitful to really concentrate on the strategy to put a lot of public resources into creating this innovative landscape. So the investment in this research institutes and research infrastructure does not only come from the city of Dresden, but here is how this system works. There is support by the federal state. They have funding schemes. And there is also support by the central government, so financial-wide. So there is different functions, different resources. This is again going to be the focus on the talk given by Mark Bovenschulter in the second session. But the strategy to concentrate on innovation that has been built by the city of Dresden and then also been highly supported by the Free State of Saxony and by the central government of Germany has been highly successful. And then how do you attract companies? So there was a question on how do I attract a company like Bosch and how do you attract a company like Volkswagen? If I would like to look on these two examples, it's not a single answer, because I do believe that it's wise for a public authority to see all these companies as different clients with different demands. We try to come up with individual solutions. So not saying here that is something we always offer, but listen what the companies really need and try to come up with a specific package in order to meet their demand. And in the best case, you come up with a corporation like in the Volkswagen case. They said, we are changing our business, or our business is changing due to the market. We will come up with new technology solutions. So we will introduce a lot of electric cars into the market. How can we do that together? And I told you that we put a lot of emphasis on putting up infrastructure in order to be together with a company that is in a disruption. We are in a city also being in a disruption. Let's try things out. Be a place where references can be put up. So let's say reference projects in this smart city environment, where you can try charging issues, where you can try sharing issues. So really have this innovative region, so a playing field for the company, but also an opportunity for the city administration to learn on how these new technologies can be transferred in benefits for our citizens, because that's important and that's our job, which we have to do. So this mutual looking for beneficial solutions is something we have been very successful with Volkswagen. So how did we support Volkswagen besides this setting up of public charging infrastructure? Remember, we were also working on setting up a startup incubation program. So Volkswagen put up a budget for the startup companies that will be selected by a selecting process. And we said if these companies that had been selected coming from different German cities, but also from various cities in Europe, we even had startups from Israel, we had startups from Canada. What do? They come to Dresden for 6 months. And how can we support this program? And we said we will just provide housing. Because if you have a long onboarding process, because the startups, they have to do a lot of bureaucracy and administrative work, including a search for living for 6 months, that takes away a lot of time, which they actually can put into their development project issues. And so we simply provided housing. So we really turned over the keys when they arrived, and then we collected the keys when they left. So really, we try to be pragmatic. See how can we lower certain challenges, how we can basically pass the way. A second supporting scheme which we set up for the startups is a small funding budget. So we said if the technology that has been developed by them, let's say a smart parking sensor technology, we provide 100,000 euros for having their first pilot demonstration project. That helps them to, let's say, for example, attract investors, attract further clients for their new technologies. And for us, it helps us to get around with new technology and try out how that can help us to put up into our smart city regime in the city of Dresden. So that may be 2 examples on how we work together with Volkswagen and how we will be working together with Volkswagen. But this has been really on putting up an individual solution. And since we have been so successful by cooperation like that, we also do cooperations with other companies and try to really make a difference. Why do we need to make a difference? It's for sure that regions are in competition between investments, and you have to come up with creative ideas in order to show the companies, to show industry how they can bring faster their innovation to the market in your area compared to other areas in your, let's say, for us in Germany, but we believe it's even a more European competition or sometimes even worldwide. So we have to answer the question, how can we speed up the development of new solutions in these companies in order to they can achieve market solutions faster? Funding programs, that is more or less the question to COVID. COVID has also been very, very challenging for our industry, especially at the city centers. There has been no tourists for a very long time. Then there has been a strong lockdown over a very long period, and there especially the restaurants, hotels, they had a very strong challenge to see. So there have been funding schemes, especially by the federal ministries, so by the central government of Germany. But it took quite a while until these funding programs had been started. So from the city perspective, we tried to add in a very early stage, especially for the smallest companies in our city, funding programs and funding grants until these larger programs and funding schemes had been deployed by the central government. But again, it's an example where the municipality level, the free state level, and then also the federal level try to work together in order to really support, in this case, economy. So I hope I did not forget any of the questions, but let me stop with answering for now.
저희 토론을 계속
Yes, we will continue our discussion with the other discussants. Next, we have City Councillor Park Hae-soo of Chungju City Council.
먼저 저희에게서 어떤
First off, I'd like to thank you for organizing today's event. As for Chungju City, our fiscal autonomy is about 18th, and our budget is about 1.9 trillion won. And Professor An, you talked about strong democracy, and you mentioned Switzerland and Nordic countries, and you mentioned that we need to reform our constitution for us to become that strong democracy, and we also need bicameral system, is what you also mentioned, and I completely agree. Decentralization and fiscal decentralization is very important, and to achieve that, we need to reform the constitution, and in order to achieve true decentralization, we should begin by having a bicameral legislature. And secondly, I'd like to comment on the second presentation.
In the city of Chungju, the population is around 220,000. So I think it's about half the size of Dresden. And I think we have similar projects going on as well. We also have research centers that engage with universities and the industry. We have a 3D research center within the University of Transportation. So if we look at the goals of our programs and our population, we have many similarities, although the city of Chungju is now just doing its baby steps. So we have begun cooperation between academia and industry. You talked about the EV program in Dresden, and I'm very envious of your program. The city of Chungju is home to Hyundai facilities that are building stacks that are used in hydrogen vehicles. And what is unfortunate is that the production facility for this device has been built up in another city. I don't think that the general public has a clear idea of the difference between hydrogen vehicles and electric vehicles. And it is true that electric vehicles seem to be taking off more than hydrogen vehicles. So from the perspective of the city of Chungju, it is good that we are taking the first steps with hydrogen vehicles. And this has led to some revitalization of the regional economy. And I would like to thank the speaker for sharing his insights so I can learn.
Thank you, City Councillor Park Hae-soo, for your comments. And now we'll hear from Secretary General Baek Han-gi from Chungju Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Thank you for all the comments and presentations.
여쭈려고 그러는데
And I have a question to actually Professor
분권 이제 주로 말씀하셨는데
An-sang-ho, sorry. We talked about decentralization.
중앙하고 지방하고
Currently,
많은
the local government and the central government, there is not that much of a distribution of power, I believe. So we don't have the level of decentralization that we want. We do believe that there should be more power distribution between central and local governments. And I think we need to take a step-by-step approach to achieve such decentralization. Maybe we can select some cities to run a pilot test of true decentralization. And if those tests turn out to be successful, then maybe we can roll it out throughout the entire nation. The reason why I say this is because if we decentralize at one go throughout the entire nation, maybe some local governments do not have the capacity to self-govern 100% today. So when it comes to drafting their ordinances and local rules, there can be conflicts caused by differences in opinions.
그거를 하려고 그러면은
And if we want to do that on a local level, the provincial officials, the city officials should have the capacity to do so before we start a true decentralized system in Korea. That was sort of my comment on the presentation. And when I saw your presentation material, you talked about the 1950s during the former President Chon's era. It was when the nation was 100% centralized by the central government. And the Korean economic growth rate was about the -%, but between 1980 to 1988, it increased 10 to 12%. So in that sense, decentralization can't be seen as a 100% answer for revitalizing local economies. But I do believe that we do need decentralization to a certain extent. And you also argued that we need a bicameral legislature. But in order for us to have a bicameral legislature, many politicians, professors, and experts in the field should undergo discussion, sufficient amount of discussion, so that we build a healthy and sound bicameral legislature in Korea. And when I saw Sejong City recently, they are trying to build their capacity of local autonomy. For instance, they are trying to allow the residents to operate the residential tax income funds. They are looking into this potential plan. So that's why I think we should run a pilot test in selected cities when it comes to these fiscal decentralization, and then take a step-by-step approach until we go bicameral.
Thank you, Mr. Beck. Next, I would like to invite Mr. Hong Song-yong, who is a counselor of the Seoul Metropolitan Council. Thank you very much for the invitation. I think Mr. Han talked about how I was a part of the Dokdo program. I don't think I have time to go into detail regarding that. I have comments regarding Professor An's presentation.
You talked about the strong democracy, and in your presentation we could see your strong will in achieving that strong democracy. And I felt really that your presentation was really remarkable. I respect you in that regard. And we need to transform our weak democracy into a strong democracy. And to do that, Professor An, you mentioned that we need to have an upper house. You said that Korea is a strange country because we don't have a upper house. But one thing I'd like to ask you is that There must be some demerits of bicameral systems, such as maybe it's too time consuming or takes a lot of money. And there must be merits of a unicameral system. So maybe you can explain a little bit more about the pros and cons of these two systems.
As for Mr. Franke, listening to your presentation, I felt that if we had a couple of Dresden cities in Korea, it could really strengthen the economy and democracy. You talked about how Dresden has only a population of 500,000. And in fact, the city of Ulsan or Pohang or Changwon, I think are similar in size and have a similar sort of industrial background. I think many municipal governments should set up an economic development office. I was impressed to see that Dresden has one. If you look at the city of Seoul, we do not have a office dedicated to development. I think that just the fact that you have an economic development office really shows the commitment by Dresden cities. I would like to ask if you think that there is one powerful way to support cities of Dresden size in Korea. I will also continue to moderate. I would like to ask the floor for questions or comments. So why don't we collect some opinions and questions before we hear the answers from our two presenters? Then I would like to invite Professor An to respond to the questions and comments.
Professor Kim Tae-jin, I will answer your questions first. Constitutional reform, especially the constitutional reform that I'm talking about, results in big power shift. So it does not happen in an everyday life. Usually after a war or revolution, it tends to be successful. But I guess it's far-fetched for us to achieve that kind of a dramatic power shift. Rather, we need to achieve constitutional reform via the enlightened citizens. That's the only way. And 70% of the public responds that they want to amend the constitution. But they cannot pressure the political circle to the extent to achieve that constitutional reform. The reason behind this is that they do not understand the importance of decentralization. Most people who assert decentralization are experts or people who work in related fields. But the majority of Korean people know that they have to do this, but they cannot be certain about it because they don't have much knowledge. So we need to make sure that we can increase their knowledge on this topic. And there are less than 10 countries who have strong democracy around the world: Germany, Switzerland, and all the Nordic countries, which are about 5. And there are some other small countries. But as you know, Germany was very centralized during the Hitler's regime. And the coalition forced them to change their constitution after the war. And the wise thing about the German people was that they were very proactive in changing their constitution, even though this was enforced upon them. And they took many measures and initiatives to decentralize. And that's why they were able to become what it is today. And that's why we have foundations like Friedrich Naumann Foundation that hold events like this. They are not just being active in their own country to decentralize, but they are working in other countries to promote freedom and decentralization by spending money, by putting in effort. So these efforts that's being carried out internally in Germany is being done regardless of the parties, regardless of their opinions. Everyone is working hard in Germany. I know it's a big country with over about 80 million people, and they're really working hard to build a strong democracy, and there's something truly that we can learn from. This is not a problem of parties. This is about increasing the status and the quality of that country. And by doing so, we can promote further economic development of our state. And there was another valuable comment from our discussants. You mentioned about the 1950s and the 1980s. They were authoritarian regimes, but our economy grew exponentially. And yes, during the Japanese imperial era, the Korean economy grew dramatically. And under the Stalin's regime, about 6% economic growth was achieved. But at the same time, a lot of people lost their lives due to many massacres in these regimes. And if you look at the book, Why Nations Fail by Asmaglu and Robinson, authoritarian regimes do prosper for a certain extent. To the extent that they are killing people, they mobilize all the resources they have in an authoritarian way, and they invest in the industry, and that can lead to economic growth. But if this lasts for a long time, it will not be successful. And there's not a single example in the history where this was successful. And in the Korean history, we saw demonstrations in Chungju trying to democratize our nation, and so many people lost their lives and shed their blood to democratize our country despite the authoritarian regime. And I don't think it was President Chun's effort which led to the economic growth of Korea. I don't think it's something we can easily say that it was thanks to that regime which led to the growth of our country. I'm not saying that Secretary General Peck said this. I'm saying that some people in our nations believe so. They believe that the authoritarian regime empowered our country to grow exponentially. So they think we need to go back to the former President Park's era in order to make our country prosper. But that is nonsense. We saw how many people had to struggle to make our country to become a democracy. Economic growth does not just happen by the leadership of politicians, but it also happens by the citizens. The citizens prevent corruption and other problems. And you can see this if you read a book called Going to Freedom. So to become a strong democracy, we need to realize that this is a difficult task. There are less than 10 countries who are strong democracies in the world. We have leaped forward greatly in terms of economic growth, but if we want to advance even further, we need to go through that narrow gate and become a strong democracy. And to do that, it's not just the politicians, but the general public needs to be enlightened. And not just the people in the metropolitan area, but also the citizens in this very city of Chungju needs to become enlightened and pursue this initiative. For years, our KIPA conducted empirical studies, and it turns out that the stronger a strong democracy is, the more innovative that country is. And there are other empirical studies that back this up. But I'm just saying that KIPA was able to find this out through their study. And Mr. Hong Sung-yong talked about the bicameral system. And yes, it's not going to be easy to introduce the bicameral legislature. And the discussions that's going on right now with regards to this topic is that we can come up with a semi-bicameral system. So we build a house in local regions, so we can maintain our current system, but we can also come up with a city province consultative body. So we have about 50 or 60 representatives of each 17 electoral districts who come together, maybe 2 or 3 members from Sejong, and other people from other members can come together and build a semi-opera house. So if the next presidential candidate pledges to build that quasi-opera house, we can have a similar function in place, although we don't have a real opera house. So we can benchmark Germany's opera house in that regard. And Secretary General Baek Han-gi mentioned about having pilot cities. Let's test it out in small cities and roll it out throughout the nation. And I think it's a good idea. For instance, Jeju is a specially autonomous city. And if we say we can't test this in all cities in Korea, we can first start off by testing it in Jeju and then roll it out throughout the nation. Lastly, to be successful in constitutional reform, the public needs to be enlightened and the leaders need to become servant-type leaders. But, we can't force the politicians to let go of their established powers. It's not just Korea, but also Switzerland and Nordic countries. The people who have powers will not let go of their power. But at a certain level, if we achieve a certain level of democracy, let's say Switzerland or Nordic countries, the people who have powers do give up some of their powers because they want ultimately a better country. Read the book written by former Chancellor Merkel. She also talks about servant-type leaders. And she talks about that's the politics of Germany. But in Korea, we tend to think that politics is about confrontational politics. And if we keep thinking about politics in this manner, we will remain a weak democracy. So with the upcoming presidential election, all of our citizens and led by the media, we should try to enlighten the citizens about having a new system and reforming the constitution.
네, 감사합니다. 지금까지 제1분과에서
Thank you very much.
국내
So far in this first session, we heard 2 presentations, 2 papers from a Korean presenter and a German presenter. We are, in fact, over time. So I think we will have to wrap up the first session, and we will take a short break and resume with the second session. Thank you very much. That was a short break, but I hope you enjoyed that break. We will now begin the second session, which will be moderated by City Councillor Yang Pyong-ho.
네, 안녕하세요. 반갑습니다.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen.
저는 서울의
I am City Councillor of the Gangdong District. I am Yang Pyong-ho. It's a great honor for me to moderate this session in this very important international seminar. I hope that I can contribute to a lively discussion during the seminar. We will now begin session 2 without further ado. We have 2 presenters in this session.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for the kind introduction. I'm really happy to contribute to this very important conference, and I got some impressions from the beforehand carried out a discussion. I found it very interesting how you touched the point of how democracy and a strong democracy can improve as well economic growth and wealth. And this is quite an interesting topic. I don't know if we honestly have this in mind so many times in Germany. Maybe it's just taken for us for given. As it was mentioned after World War II, this was the general concept of the German state, the post-Hitler country, to have it more decentralized. But honestly spoken, this concept of democracy improves as well innovativeness and economic growth. Comes back to Richard Florida, this US economist, and he developed this concept of the 3 T's. Now it's technology, talent, and tolerance. And tolerance includes as well, obviously, the variety of different opinions, lifestyles, and political views. And this is exactly what characterizes a vivid democracy. But coming now back to my main issue, how the interplay of central government and local government will improve or boost even local economic development. And to do so, we can't speak about this subject without looking on a multi-level play. This is the European level, this is the central government level, and this is the regional or local government level. And all this makes up something like a fully fledged approach to improve regional development as it is. And of course, the economic development is a strong figure in here. And we start with the right-hand side of this graph where you see European Regional Development Fund and above as well, European Agriculture Fund for Regional Development. This is a bit special, but let's focus on the ERDF. This is a very strong program. Obviously, this is not only directed to Germany, but to all members of the European Union to definitely improve research and development, to increase growth, and to level out regional disparities. And we have as well these central government programs. This is a big bunch of about more of 20-25 programs. I will come to this as well. And many of these programs address economic growth as well, most likely in regions or in transition where we have structural changes. Of course, as well as you may know, we have coal mining regions. We have something like a Rust Belt as well in Germany. They are still in transition, and as well quite strong regions like in the southwestern parts, which are coined by automotive industries. They undergo as well structural change. So national programs improve this. And we have, of course, programs of the federal states, of the Länder, the decentralized level. And these as well look for growth, social inclusion, education, and so on and so on. And we have as well some joint undertakings, joint tasks from the federal level and the central government level. One very prominent is improvement of the regional economic growth structure. This is for the German abbreviation GRW. And all these programs have something very much in common, as I said, to overcome growth weaknesses, to improve education level and workforce, and to contribute to regional economic growth. And this is something like the priority scheme of the EU Regional Fund, the European Regional Development Fund. And we have here the four main pillars that are addressed. And the big thing is that the money comes from the European Commission, but it has to meet regional needs. So we have something like operational programs. This is region specific. And this follows just of the objectives which are made by the regions. Yeah, you have something like a smart specialization strategy. This is a strong European concept developed within the last, I don't know, 15, 20 years, and is now fully implemented. And to have one of these strategies is a precondition to receive funding from the European level. And let's look at the smart specialization concept. As I mentioned, this is definitely a place-based approach. So it's not something like a one-size-fits-all approach where we have something like general national KPIs, and this has to be adapted in every region, but every region itself defines what are the possibilities, what are the assets, what are the potentials. And we've seen this beginning of the 2000 years. All regions wanted to become region for health and wealth and well-being and medicine. And we had very strong impacts on developing these offers, health, tourism, and so on and so on. But just a few number of these regions really were able to establish a cluster or something like a local profile for health, wealth, and medicine. So by now, there's another hype. Obviously, everybody wants to do something with artificial intelligence, but not all regions do have the potential to set up a real working ecosystem of artificial intelligence. So you have to level out where are your strengths, what can you do, what might be possible, and what are your limits, and you have to recognize this as well. And if you do so, you do take priorities for investment and the means you implement. You have to really include all the stakeholders that are present in the region in the fields of interest to really have something like a participation process to find out what are the potentials and whom could contribute to. And you do have something like a broad innovation approach, including as well social innovation, and it's very practical. Yeah, it's not something like next generation of bionuclear energy, but it's more something like down to earth, what could really help the regional economy. And of course, you have something like a learning program approach where you do monitor, evaluate, and improve this like a continuous improvement process. To look at how to take these priorities, I would come up with a nice example. This was given by Ricardo Hausmann, the economist from Harvard University. And he explained that regional development you can compare to Scrabble. Maybe you know this game. And look at these three animals, a lion, a bear, and a zebra. And now you look, which animals show a certain similarity? And you might come up with the bear and the lion because they're both predators. They have more or less the same size. Both are able to climb trees. They can run quite fast. And yeah, even the appearance is quite similar. And the zebra doesn't figure in this comparison. But if you look at when the bear wants to convert into another animal, you might say the lion is closer, but honestly, it's the zebra. It's more easy to convert the bear and a zebra than a lion. And I show you this. Yeah, you see this? You do have to change just the existing letters and then add the that. And then you have a zebra made out of a bear. If you would like to change the bear into a lion, you have to change all the letters and you have to start from scratch. And this is as well a concept which is applied very much in these decentralized regional developments, which is not something like lighthouse, but is more a broad approach, is the concept of related variety. You can apply this on enterprise level by looking, I have all these knowledges and possibilities and technical machinery. I produce A, and what is needed to produce as well B. And then you have to find the gap and fill this gap, and you are better off, have another business model. And you can do this as well on regional level, yeah, strengthen cooperation, get some new players there, have some investments made, get R&D institutes started or at least included, and so on and so on. So this is to make something with the regional level. And coming to this, you have all in all 4 types of capital to improve growth on the regional level. Yeah, you have, of course, the human capital, which is a skilled workforce and all what they know and what they can do. This is at least something like the formal level, but as well the informal level of knowledge and capabilities. And this has to be mobilized. You have the relation capital. This is more or less the cooperation between institutions and organizations, yeah, with partners, with networks. And this is as well something like the absorptive capacity of each organization. So the ability to take up new knowledge. You have the structure capital. This is how your organization is company or an institute is made up, yeah, and you have something like the work organization. Is it more agile and flexible, or is it more Taylorism, which hinders the interchange of knowledge and the flow of knowledge? And this is a nice concept as well by Hausmann and Hidalgo. If you would like to look it up, they have as well an atlas of complexity, economic complexity, is the complexity capital. And this is something like the uniqueness of a region, or as well of a nation, resulting from the variety of products and skills they have. So all in all, it's something like the sum of useful knowledge. And you, as I mentioned, you can see in internet the Atlas of Economic Complexity, and you, with a certain pleasure, will find out that Korea, but as well Germany, are in the top ranking and about the top 5 of economic complexity when different nations are compared. So Germany, but as well, and it's growing, Korea has a strong potential to further develop products following the concept of recombining the existing stuff. That means related variety. And to do so, in Germany, on a regional level, the cluster approach is very strong. And I will show you now here the timeline. Unfortunately, it's only in German. I didn't have a translated version, but I think it's because just marks some names. Maybe it's not so difficult to translate it to English. Above, we have the federal states, the Länder. This is something like the decentralized level. And below, we have the central, the national state level. And you see, there's a large variety of the time of the last 25, 30 years where this cluster concept has been developed, implemented, and improved. And the Big Bang in cluster in Germany was the year 1994 with the Bioregio competition. Started from the central government, but then it was spread out. And as you see, there's a large variety. And the interplay is that normally on the federal, on the Länder level, on the decentralized level, the regional level, we have cluster activities, and then some central government programs come to pimp them up, to look for the best regional clusters, maybe as well in a certain sector like biotechnology, and make them grow to become internationally recognized lighthouses. So this is something like excellent clusters. And when we talk about all these excellent clusters, we have, of course, a systemized overview on those initiatives. And we have something like a national cluster platform. The URL is given there as well. And this is the possibility to look up and to find out a bit more about the clusters. And as well, the clusters are always regional initiatives. It's not something like we don't have a national cluster on automotive or whatever. Maybe there are coordinative networks, but the work, the research, the growth is done on a regional level. And the money injected comes from the regional level as well from the national level. And we have two big cluster initiatives. This is Go Cluster from the Ministry of Economics and Energy. They look for the about 100 best clusters in Germany, but best clusters is not producing scientific knowledge, but to address especially needs of small and medium-sized enterprises in different regions, in different industrial sectors. And we have the Leading Edge Cluster initiative from the Federal Ministry for Education and Research. They promote some big lighthouses. There is a slight overlap between the cluster members from Go Cluster and from Leading Edge Cluster, but it's not something like an automatism that each cluster from Leading Edge Clusters as well Go Cluster member. So it's something like a well-balanced system which allows power mobility and interchange from one side to the other. But of course, they address different project schemes and they have as well different objectives and visibilities. And as I said, all of this happens on the regional level, even if the money comes from the central government. I think this is a very determining issue because the responsibility, the definition, and the execution is always left to regional actors. So the central government only looks for compliance of the general objectives and lines from the funding scheme, but all the how to do it, when and with whom is left to the regional actors and players. And so this is as well something like decentralized democracy. I would like to give you now two examples which do not come from these cluster initiatives. These are two more or less new funding scheme. One comes from the Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy, and this addresses especially regions and transition regarding automotive industry. It is quite a big funding scheme with about 200 million euro. And they look for all these regional industrial districts or clusters from automotive industry, which face now changes resulting from e-mobility, from digitalization, autonomous driving, decarbonization, and so on and so on. And this is not only the region of Stuttgart or Wolfsburg or Munich, where you think, okay, there's a big concentration of automotive industry, but this is well all the supplier industry and networks, even as well in the Eastern countries, which have something like a special focus. And all these regions are helped by these transformative networks to find something like a vision for the future development, and of course to develop a strategy, and not only a strategy on paper, but to turn this into action. And this is as well left to the regional actors, how to do it, when to do it, what are the visions, and so on and so on. And of course, this is meant to have not only lifetime for the time of funding, but as well a sustainable perspective, which is something like a more stable and permanent structure to improve regional development. And this is as well a very interesting and important issue in this context. Even if it focuses on the automotive industry, it includes as well neighbor sectors like optical technologies, IT, or machinery and production, manufacturing, because they are so closely related. So from this initiative, a strong impulse for the whole region has to be addressed. Another network is from the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs, and they promote continuous education and training networks, CET. And of course, you know, all the transition and transformation processes like automation and digitalization, seem to have something like an ambiguous future. Many say yes, more jobs will be created by new technologies. Others say some jobs will be killed by new technology. This seems to be something like an outbalanced scheme, but at least one thing is true. Many employees will face a change of their job profile. They have to adapt to new skills and new challenges, and this process has to be improved as well. And of course, once again, this is on the regional level, because national statistics that say there's a lack of IT specialists might be true in cities like Berlin or Munich, but it may not be true in regions like northwestern part of Germany. So you have to have as well a very specific regional perspective. You have to look for the conditions, what are regional needs, what are regional potential, and as well find possibilities to improve skill development and competencies. And of course, both lastly mentioned networks can be combined. So a region which has already received one of these set networks can as well combine it with one of these automotive transformation networks. So it's something like a synergy potential. The only thing you have to avoid, and it is independent where the money comes from, you don't have to have double funding for the same thing. This is excluded, but this can be easily obtained. So coming to an end, what are the key elements of regional economic development in Germany? This was already mentioned in the last discussion. By now, the federal setup of Germany is in our DNA. Yeah, so decentralization is always present. It may be not always helpful when we look at the education system. Stronger standardization, harmonization might be helpful in some points, but this is definitely something which has to be discussed in another context. But generally, I think we all are very familiar with federalism. There's always some complaints, but honestly spoken, it works quite well, can be improved, as everything can be improved, but it works. And when we come to the regional level, all regions in Germany undergo some structural change. As I mentioned, even the strong economic region and the economic powerhouses like Stuttgart or Munich, they face some big changes, even if today's business model seems to be okay, but on the horizon, there are already some dark clouds visible. We have a very broad spectrum on regional activities. This is something like a whole bunch. And of course, sometimes you could ask yourself, is it really necessary to have so many different programs? But the good thing is they all have the same objective, and they are many times totally complementary, so they can be combined. There's now something like one ministry promotes A and ministry B and C as well promote A. It's normally, they have some special accents, they have some special target groups in mind. They do balance the different levels of objectives, so it's quite a complementary thing. And there's a strong tendency to address a whole spectrum as well of needs. Yeah, it's not something like one program only, the regional economic development, the other social cohesion, and the other education. It's more integrated as well, and this includes as well improvement of infrastructure and institutional functioning. When we look at the regional level, it's quite clear that we don't have a one-size-fits-all solution. So every regional initiative is tailor-made. It's not something like the spaceship is coming down and says this is the way it has to be done. So the frame is given by the funding scheme, but how to fill in the frame, this is definitely left to the regional actors, and the regional actors as well include regional governments. This might be on the level of cities like municipalities, but of course as well of the land of the federal states. And already mentioned this once, the funding money comes from different sources. European, national or regional level, but the general idea to improve the regional development, to have more decentralized capacities and growth, and as well in perspective of life for people living there. This is all shared, and this has always to be made up by the stakeholders in the regions. So I hope I was able to give you a slight insight to have something like a fully fledged overview of the possibility of the possible programs and funding schemes, and how the interplay is made up is unfortunately possible within 30 minutes, but I'm happy to answer your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mark Boven-Schulte. Next, I would like to invite Mr. Robert Neff for his presentation.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am from Switzerland, and our country gets good rankings in all types of international indexes. What is the secret of this success? We are ready to learn, ready to work, ready to save money, and ready to defend ourselves. But we share this readiness with a lot of other countries all over the world. Success is always based on skill and luck. And I am convinced that my country's wealth and high standard of living are not exclusively or even mainly the result of unique talents and endeavors. They are in the main the outcome of favorable historical circumstances and fortuitous events which spared us from involvement in last century's 2 world wars. South Korea has also a very specific and unique historical situation, and I do hope that an exchange of successful experiences can be helpful for both sides. One of the roots of our success is the fact that the political and fiscal centralization went on slowlier than in other countries. So we went slowlier in the wrong direction. Sometimes this is better than to play the role of a pioneer in the experiment of big errors and failures. I am convinced that centralization of power, and especially the centralization of the power to tax, will come to a dead end all over the world, and that the less centralized will be in a better position. Local government and local taxation and the competition of jurisdictions, towns and regions, combined with local direct democracy, are the most important roots of our success, and I am happy to share our experiences with you. One of the most important secrets of a successful politics is local autonomy, combined with federalism based on the principle of subsidiarity. The common problems have to be solved in the most private possible framework and at the most local and regional possible level. The burden of the proof is always on the side of the centralizers. This leads us to the first thesis. Freedom is based on self-ownership and autonomy. The concept of autonomy, it means the ability to give oneself the rules and to solve your own problems directly and in your own expense, could create a bridge between the concepts of freedom and decentralization. But what does autonomy actually mean? There are many levels at which autonomy may be pursued. At the level of individuals, there is the personal autonomy. At the level of a group, there is the social autonomy. And at the level of nations, regions, and communities, there is the political concepts of national, regional, and local governments. The meaning of the term autonomy depends on who actually are these autonomous bodies which make their own rules. As a citizen of a small state, I know from experience that the group which makes its own rules should be small. if the individual is to retain any power of influence. Small is beautiful, as they say, but no principle should be generalized or made absolute. The danger that the small group will increase the power of mischievous, harmful, and egoistic opinions should always be borne in mind. Let us stay with the example of the family. Families are the best example of non-centralistic experimenting. Some fail, but a lot of them do succeed, and families can serve as a learning process between generations. The same can be done on the local political level. That is the risk as well as the hope of heterogeneous experiments not regulated by coercion. If we had only one type of family or only one way of bringing up children specified in a norm to the minutest detail, all families would be the same, namely unhappy. In the same way, the same could be said about either social group as well as about nation state. This can be put together in a second thesis. Non-centralization means pluralism, diversity, and the possibility of choice. It brings opportunities as well as risks. He who wants to get away with the risks destroys the chances in the process and brings about a general worsening of well-being in comparison with the starting point. As all other principles, also this one has its own limits. Too small systems can be inefficient and dangerous. Too small may be not beautiful at all. A big has always the opportunity to combine the advantages of being big and powerful with the advantage of competing smaller communities. But as a rule, the powerful and big have no more challenge to learn and to adapt the new situations by innovations. This leads us directly to the thesis number 3. The small is beautiful principle must be combined with that of competition of small, transparent, and open units so that the danger of extreme solutions is minimized. This all sounds quite theoretical, but I shall provide enough empirical evidence in the following remarks. Allow me only a small terminological side note. I do not like the term decentralization. It implies that one centralizes first to be able to decentralize afterwards. It is the same as making the error first in order to be able to correct it afterwards. The best way is a complete demise of all unnecessary centralization. This often is, however, only rarely to be found. The reality is that we have to start with over-centralized structures all over the world. Your country has been cut in pieces. This is a tragedy, but also a chance for new beginning and experiments. In global rankings of economic freedom, South Korea, as other smaller countries, is in a good position. If reunification ever occurs, what I hope, it must be linked to a concept of decentralization on both sides. I am sure that there are points of reference in Korea's rich past. Hence my fourth thesis. Centralized structures are generally hard to decentralize, but in the long run, the costs of over-centralization are higher than the costs of decentralization. As most nations of the world are centralized to a high degree, the term decentralization is unfortunately quite realistic. It would be nicer to be able to speak of non-centralization, of instituting or reinstituting non-centrality as the overreaching principle. Decentralization is the path and non-central autonomy is the objective. This is more than a mere word game. When we decentralize, we assume and stress the center, and the umbilical cord between the center and the member state or community remains. The picture of an umbilical cord is actually too romantic. In reality, it is the center which feeds the periphery, and in a direct reversal of its claims to be providing for its children. Central governments and their bureaucracies are a mixture of necessary evils and pig-headedness of their former sovereignty. This is the fifth thesis, might therefore go as follows. A big and solvable problem will not be made solvable by letting the specialist from the center. To find a solution, one must cut the problem in pieces. The solution can be discovered empirically by trial and error in small competing units which are not obliged anymore to communicate through the center. This is in fact the principle in the base of Internet. Everyone is connected to everyone and can communicate directly. Here we are getting closer to the concrete proposals, yet still the level of abstraction is relatively high. The principle of killing off centralization by returning to a proper autonomy is valid, once again, only subject to some modification. In reality, compromises have often been sought, and in combination with other principles and factors, its radical nature may have to be milded somewhat. Freedom is a sensation, a living and dynamic process, but let us not dwell too long on definitions. Who has never experienced the sensation of self-ownership and taking full responsibility of one's life will not understand any explanation anyway. The best way of demonstrating the phenomenon of freedom is by referring to its opposites. People often ask me, when in the history of freedom began, in what period should we search the advent of freedom? I do not believe that freedom was discovered by a philosopher, be it Aristotle, John Locke, or Adam Smith. Freedom is discovered by any young child when it discovers the possibility to say no. For the parents, it may be a challenge, but for the child, it is the first chance to show his independence. I call it the creative dissidence. My sixth thesis is about the advent of freedom and autonomy. The advent of freedom and autonomy is the realization that we have the option of saying no when someone wants to do something we do not fancy doing. Freedom is a road out of serfdom, a refusal to be dependent on others. I imagine that former colonies with liberated themselves have just the right idea of what freedom and decentralization mean. It is a road that leads from the foreign-ruled center to freedom and autonomy. A journey along this path must not stop too early. Powerful centers do not have to come from outside, from the colonial lords. They can all too easily develop within the post-colonial or post-socialist country. For this reason, the decentralization route to more freedom is also from a form of internal decolonization and privatization, a fact not always fully appreciated. The use of limits of comparability. Freedom and non-centralism are not philosophical concepts. They are political programs. To some extent, they always remain on the level of utopia because not always can they be implemented to the full extent, but one can usually go along with before stumbling upon any serious problems. The history is full of examples of both successful and less successful programs. That leads us to a thesis on this subject. It's the seventh overall. We cannot learn directly from the past or from comparison of systems, since the two constellations in the two systems can never be the same. However, the history is one big lab, whence the only useful information and hints can come to the politicians. Failure to appreciate this is a bad strategy. Political experiments without any reference to historical experience are in general doomed to fail, usually at a very high cost. Equally, a comparison of different nation states has its own risks. What is possible in Switzerland may be completely impossible in South Korea. Nations and people are different, but the instinct of autonomy and of self-determination has anthropological roots. My eighth thesis goes as follows. There are a few omnivalent rules which link all peoples of the world, regardless of their cultural background, development stage, to historical experience. All over the world, people as you and I are quite similar on many levels. There is such thing as anthropological constants and universal human rights. People pursue happiness, and having once achieved it, they prefer to be let alone. Most people cannot be bothered to constantly co-decide what other people are to do. They are quite content in if they are allowed to do what they want. Hence my ninth thesis. Being able to decide over oneself is more important than co-deciding over others. Most people want to mind their own business without others intruding in. They do not want to go to war for others and do not want to pay taxes if they have no control over their height and the way of their spending. They want to have their life, identity, and property protected without the danger of being arrested, without cause. In short, there is a tendency, especially among the intellectuals, to overestimate the degree to which people differ. The differences are important in private life, but on the political level, they are certainly not the decisive factor. Political science compares the states of the world with ideas how they could be made better. The Swiss way of non-centralization and freedom is our way. Switzerland started as a successful secession from the Habsburg dynasty in the 13th century. Swiss peasants and shepherds realized that they can only keep their independence if they create a political union based on mutually agreed terms and rules which set out mutual rights and obligations. This is the foundation of all states. Freedom is limited somewhat in order to protect the independence by a sensible centralization of legal force, by an introduction of a government with limited power. Thesis number 10. Political science recognizes four main barriers against the advance of etatization and centralization. First, rule of law, which guarantees its citizens' rights of freedom against the intrusive state. Second, separation of power, which constrains the state power. Third, decentralization of political power into smaller competing units. Fourth, subsidiarity principle, whose effect is to weaken the blind belief in the benevolence of a central government. All the four mentioned barriers are effective only to a limited extent. Thesis 11. A completely reliable and completely effective barrier against the growth of state power and centralization has never been discovered anywhere. Switzerland has proved relatively immune against the law of growing state and fiscal power and centralization. We have always been quite slow. but one can never go slow enough in the wrong direction. The secret of this slow pace was never on a high level of intelligence of the citizens or even of the government's representatives. The secret was in the high degree of non-centrality of our system. Every canton had traditionally a high degree of autonomy. For over 500 years, we had been those union of states along confederative lines. And only in the last 150 years, we have been a United States along the lines of the United States of America. But even today, we are accustomed to a division of powers to the benefit of the communities and the cantons, the members of the federation. A third of all direct taxation stays with the communities, a third goes to the cantons, and only a third passes to the federal state. It is taxed citizens who decide directly by a majority voting on the level of taxes. All powers that are not explicitly passed to the federal state stay automatically in the regional and local level. Let the local level take the responsibility and find a solution, because the local solutions have been quite varied. It usually look a lot of time and transaction costs to find a central consensus, which delay has so far been providing to be an effective barrier to excessive centralization. Naturally, however, these costly negotiations have also been somewhat counterproductive at times. For example, the introduction of voting rights for women was unjustifiably delayed. We are still not a part of the European Union, since a majority of the electorate and the majority of all cantons is needed for such a step. What may be useful as a barrier to an advancing centralization can prove at the same time also an unfortunate barrier for some beneficial internal reforms, such as privatization or deregulation. Other methods and institutional arrangements have to be sought also in Switzerland to bring these about. Now let's go to another model. I call it the New Zealand model. New Zealand underwent remarkable reforms in the 1980s. In short, the reform has been invoked by the following questions being put to the government about its tasks. The answers then provided the guidelines for the reform. This is my thesis 12. First question, is it still necessary? Second question, if yes, should it still be done by the government? Third question, if yes, should it be paid by the taxpayer or by the user? Having asked these questions, it was possible to reform a centralistic system which was very close to bankruptcy. The reforms are still taking place and have not been free of setbacks. Overall, however, one can confidently speak of a success story. This observation leads me to the 13th thesis, which also summarizes what has been said so far. Thesis 13. Reinventing subsidiarity. The principle of subsidiarity should become a principle that leads to more decentralization. Any higher jurisdiction should give up its competence, powers, responsibility, and give it back to the smaller jurisdictions closer to the root of the problem. Thesis 14. Non-central structures allow for learning processes and prevent general large-scale errors. The system must be open and transparent with plenty of room for the competitive forces. Centralized structures may be more efficient for execution of reforms, but they have a tendency to stiffen up after each reform, thus losing the vital flexibility. Number 15, In a sentence, deep and extensive reforms need centralistic structures. Small but lasting learning processes need competing decentralized structures. Thesis 16, last thesis. Only he who has arrived at the right mixture of the two can say that he has found the right route towards freedom and non-centralism. May this route be our common aim. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. We were able to listen to various good cases. Thank you, Mark Bovenschulte and Professor Neff. Before we start our discussion and Q&A session, I'd like to introduce another discussant who just joined us. It's Manager Hong Seung-gyu from Planning and Budget Division of Chungju City. Thank you for joining us. Now let us begin the Q&A and discussion session. I'd like to first hand the mic over to Professor Kim Tae-jin. Sorry for mispronouncing your name. Professor Kim Tae-jin, please start off. Nice to meet you, everyone. Continuing on from the first session, I'm joined again to comment on this second session. I'd like to thank Mr. Mark Bovenschulte for your presentation. Your presentation was really insightful. You talked about dividing the functions and resources between the central and local governments, and you showed specific cases of Germany in that regard. And you also told us that the decentralized system helped boost the local economic development. And I think we can learn from the cases that you've introduced to apply to Chungju City. The most interesting part was that there was the story on smart specialization strategy. And I heard that this strategy allows to support individual programs. I'd like to ask 3 questions regarding that strategy. The first is about networks and clusters. In order to promote innovation, I do believe that building clusters is very vital. And to promote regional economy, Germany introduced this cluster initiative since 1993, and you told us there's been many clusters built since then. And I think that not all clusters succeed. Maybe all in Germany succeeded, but I want to know if there's a case of a failed cluster in Germany. And if you could elaborate on why that cluster failed, that would be helpful. Second question, you said that the policies for networks, they are used in the clusters. I'd like to know what kind of support the central government gave to help these clusters and networks to build synergy. Third, you talked about the smart specialization strategy, and you told us who has the initiative to implement and execute the projects. And I would like to comment on this second presentation as well.
Thank you, Mr. Neff, for your presentation. I thought it was interesting. You talked about the roles, the financial resources, and the distribution of power between the central government and the local governments, and you talked about the Swiss case. I think your claim is that we need to base decentralization on the principle of subsidiarity. And you talked about how Swiss is a success case in terms of decentralization. And I have to say I agree with you wholeheartedly. You proposed a 1 to 15 thesis, and I think you talked about freedom, autonomy, and non-centrality, and decentralization, and you talked about the trial and errors of local governments, and you talked about experience that is needed to resolve issues. And I think all these concepts and ideas were very interesting. I have a couple of questions for you. And the first question is, you said that the Swiss system has a non-centrality, and this is what helps you guard against the central government becoming excessively large. And you talked about how there are many diverse local solutions to various problems. Do you have a more specific example of a local solution? And my second question is, I think towards the end of your presentation, you talked about how central governments or centrality is more advantageous for reforms, but that it quickly becomes less flexible. So do you have an example to illustrate that point as well? And with that, I would like to wrap up my comments.
Thank you, Professor Kim Tae-jin. Next, we'll hear from Professor Shin Won-chul. I would like to comment on the third presentation on the German case that we heard about distribution of resource and functions. I really enjoyed your presentation, and you talked about education and companies and how they work together in a cluster. And I guess we can look at the central government and the local government, and what's the role of central government when it comes to actually supporting these clusters? Let's say human resources or financial resources. How are these divided between the central and local government when supporting these clusters? And not just the central and local, but maybe regional governments. If you can answer the question in that regard, that'd be helpful. And maybe I would like to comment on the last presentation as well.
You talked about the Swiss example of decentralization, and of course we cannot make a direct comparison with Korea, but Korea has pursued centralization and privatization. I think that there were advantages to these policies, and of course on the other side there were some failures as a result. If you look at your paper, you talk about Swiss's centralization. You said that non-centrality can come in the way of privatization. And you talked about how Swiss has come up with different methods and ways to overcome the shortcomings of non-centrality. So do you have any specific policies or plans that the Swiss have in order to overcome the shortcomings of non-centrality?
Next, can Councillor Park Hae-soo comment or ask questions? The decentralization was revived after 30 years in Korea, after it was abolished. So to promote local governments, we need to give them authority and we need to give their fiscal autonomy. Let's say a specific region undergoes aging society. There's no reason for us to spend money in an aging region, to build playgrounds and fields. But there have been cases where this happened. So I would like to ask Mr. Bovenschulte, the national tax rate and local tax rate, what's the difference in Germany? In Korea, it's about from the 8:2 ratio, we're going to change it to 6:4 ratio in the future as for Korea. So when it comes to the taxing, what do you do in terms of education? In Korea, education is carried out locally, but the budget is allocated from the central government. And we also invest in future capacity. And I wonder if this is carried out by the central government or local government in Germany when it comes to human resources in the future. And you talked about networks. I don't really understand how this can work if the two networks can work together to build synergy, because they will get funded from different places. So how can these two different networks, to work together to build synergies? So I'd like to understand a little bit more. Let's say if something goes wrong, who is accountable? When it comes to the head of the local government, we may have a local council, or we may have an organization that's charged of that local government. If something goes wrong, who takes the responsibility? And how do we secure finances for that network? That's something I'd like to know.
And for Professor Neff, I have to say, this part of your presentation resonated with me. The central government actually exploits the local government. They believe that they are providing support, but in fact they take away from the local government. The central government, when allocating budgets, they treat the local governments as subordinates. And I think this should change. For the past 7 years, if you look at the budget trends, in 2014, the city of Chungju, the budget was around 700 billion. Now it's around 1 trillion won. I think we do have enough budget, but the problem is that the central government designates the projects or programs that need to be carried out with this budget. And so the local government cannot use the budget for programs or schemes that they feel are necessary. So this is very consuming. So I believe that the local government should be given discretion to use budgets as they feel fit. And I think that this can help local governments be more effective in serving the citizens. So I have a question for both speakers. I would actually like to know the ratio between the national tax versus the local tax in Germany and Swiss. And also, I'm curious to know if the central government is largely in charge of education affairs, or if local governments have the autonomy when it comes to educational affairs.
So we will listen to the answers from the two speakers.
So maybe, if I'm allowed, I would like to give a start. Quite a lot of questions, and I try to have pinpoint answers. Clusters are not clusters. The first concept of clusters came up from Porter et al., and this was just something like a regional accumulation. When we talk about clusters in Germany, we mean actively managed cluster organizations. They have a coordinator, working groups, and so on and so on. And of course, in the history, we had a lot of failures of clusters as well. They appeared and disappeared, and they didn't have enough substance to survive. But this is not the regular case. Normally, when the cluster starts up, they do have a perspective. It's always a question of funding, and there we come as well to the division of tasks between central and regional governments. Normally, the seed phase, the establishing and growth, the first initial steps of a cluster are funded by regional governments. This is not the task of the central government. But then when it comes to certain level of maturity, of some perspective of excellence, then the central programs can improve this. This is true for the leading edge clusters, for example. They build up on already strongly existing substancy. This is a bit blurry because the history when it started in Germany was bioregio competency. Then it was a central government activity, but during the last about 30 years, this is something like the rough separation of tasks. And when it comes to this definition of where the cluster goes and how it fits, for example, as well in smart specialization strategies, there's always something, the triple helix of public, science and economy. They sit together and they as well apply for the money, which is normally when it comes, for example, to smart specialization strategy, the European money, which is ERF promoted, and then you have to apply as such regional joint tasks. It's not something like just one single company normally applies to. This is more or less something like a corporation. The different tax rates, this is more or less something like a national regime. On local level and regional level, we have just slight possibilities, and the most known is part of money the companies have to pay to the municipalities. I don't know how this is called in English. The German term is Gewerbesteuer, and that differs a bit. There is something like a slight competition between municipalities, but this is not a strong and powerful thing, and that leads over to the education systems. The money for education on pupil education, school education, and universities, one of the small autonomy issues on regional level, on the Länder level, federal state level. So universities and as well school education are left to their autonomy. And as I mentioned in my presentation, this leads sometimes to a slight lack of harmony and standardization. Maybe you know the final degree of school education in Bavaria is seen very more valuable than, for example, from some northern federal states. This is as it is. Maybe this could be improved because as well on the European level, it's difficult to get in touch with 16 federal education ministers instead of one central education minister. So yeah, there are some advantages, but as well disadvantages on the federal level. On the level of vocational educational training, this is a national scheme, which is one of the powerful schemes in Germany, this Berufsbildung, vocational education training. And of course, this is as well a framework, and the autonomy is not only left on the regional level, but as well something like on the local level, on the company level, so how they fill in and meet the requirements of the framework is left to local and as well sometimes individual actors, so they can tailor-make their needs from the new employees. What else was asked? The synergies between different programs. This is normally wanted, and you only have to make clear that there is no double funding. So if you have something like one organization participates in an education collaboration program and another one in a technology, this is perfectly possible. More and more we overcome these columns from different ministries. They say, yes, if there's a possibility to combine it with such a program, this is wanted. As I said, you only have to avoid double funding, so the coordinator receives 2 times salary, 1 time from education, 1 time from the technology branch, and the responsibility definitely is left to the players. In first place, it's the coordinator of the network, but in second place, all partners who receive money, so they have to comply, they have to fulfill the requirements, but if they do so, and it doesn't fit and the outcomes are poor and you did the best, there's nobody to blame you. I mean, there is no riskless innovation, and this is true as well on regional level. I think in general, these were the main questions, and would like to hand over to Mr. Neff.
네, 감사합니다. 더 답변할 부분 없습니까?
Yes, thank you for the good questions. I start with the question that I should give you an example for local solutions. There was one very famous event in the city of Basel. A private person had to sell his 2 Picasso pictures at a very high price. And the local museum of Basel had the option to buy this, but the price was so high that they had to ask the majority of the people of the town of Basel if they would be ready to pay this 2 million for buying these pictures. And there was really a vote, and a majority was in favor of selling these pictures. And then Picasso was really surprised by this, and he decided to give 2 more Picassos to the town of Basel. So now they have 4 pictures of Picasso, and it has been voted by the majority of the people of the town of Basel. That's an example from the past. Another example for really innovative solutions also in the tax system is the canton of Zug, who had the idea that they also accept bitcoins for the taxes. That was quite risky, but it worked still now, and I think maybe it's one of the first official jurisdiction who is ready to accept this type of private money for paying the taxes. But you see, there are a lot of small examples, and it's very difficult just to give you the picture of the whole diversity in solutions of smaller and bigger problems. And I have to admit that in Switzerland, healthcare is still on the cantonal level, and also education is on the cantonal level, but there are a lot of central regulations and a lot of central financing in those things. So the diversity is really quite complex, and in fact we should have a look on all these small solutions, and I admit that that's not always that the local solution is better. We should admit that sometimes the ideas from the people in the center are more advanced and more close really to the new developments, and that on the local level also maybe they are old-fashioned and not the best solutions. This is the risk of a system which has a mixture of central and local decisions. And on my opinion, the advantage of making errors in the small thing is much higher than the advantage of having good solution by good experts from the top down. And I have also to admit that all top-down solutions, when they have been by very good experts, then they may be better than what on the local level is still in practice. We have a good example in Europe to compare local solutions, decentralized solutions, and central solutions. France has been very centralized in the 19th century.
And it was a success story. France has been very successful in culture, also in a lot of solutions, also in education, and so on. And this success was really a kind of an infection of other countries, especially also of Germany, that tried, we want to be at the same level successful as the centralizers in our neighbor country. But centralized structures can be very successful in the first maybe 50 years or even 100 years, but centralized structures have also the tendency to go in the wrong direction and to stop innovation and to stop good ideas coming bottom up. So when I compare the two systems of top-down solutions and bottom-up solutions, I don't say bottom-up is always better and top-down is always worse, but we should have kind of a dialectic between the two systems, and we try in Switzerland to keep the bottom-up route, and we have been quite successful in the last maybe 50 years. I don't think if I have answered all the questions. Maybe one was on the split between local taxes, cantonal taxes, and national taxes. The split in income taxes, which are the most important taxes, is 1/3 goes directly to the local government, 1/3 goes to the cantonal, and 1/3 goes to the national level. But in fact, it's more complicated, and I cannot go in the details. Maybe if you are interested, I can send you the more specific dates on that. I think that's it. And thank you. I learned a lot from your questions, and I hope we can keep in contact.
Thank you so much for your comment and answers. Now we will hear from Councillor Hong Sung-yong. Thank you for the wonderful presentations. In the presentation on Germany, we heard about where you would get these resources. You would get it from Europe, and you would get it from the government. However, the authority to implement the projects are given to the local players. So it's a stakeholder-based approach. Does this work out smoothly, or are there challenges when you approach it in this way? And I also have a question to Switzerland.
You talked about the income tax, direct tax, and you talked about how the citizens decide on the level of tax. I think from the Korean perspective, we should be envious. At the same time, I think it's also concerning that the citizens decide the level of tax. For Korea, we are pursuing decentralization, so I think that we have a lot of questions regarding how such a system came into place. You talked about how the citizens decide on the level of tax. Are there any side effects, whether big or small, with this process of citizens deciding on the level of tax for themselves? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hong Sung-yong. And next, we'll listen to Manager Hong Sun-gyu of Chungju City Planning and Budget Division. As introduced, I am Manager Hong Sun-gyu. In Chungju City, our fiscal autonomy is about 57%, and 70% of the local governments depend on a certain tax income. So in order for us to secure national education costs, we asked the central government to transfer a certain amount of tax to support our education costs. And when it comes to distributing resources and balanced national development, our central government is working really hard to this end. And we are asking for better alternatives as well. But I guess for Germany, when it comes to clusters, there must be differences between regions because some regions may have many good clusters who can get support from the central government. But for regional governments with not that many good clusters, they may not get support. So I wonder how this works out for those types of governments.
And as for Swiss, you talked about how a third of the tax goes to local government. But if you look at each local government, I'm sure that their budget is different. So some governments will lack financial resources. In these cases, does the central government provide support, or do you have a system that can complement the shortfall in financial resources of certain local governments?
So, Mr. Bovenschulte, could you answer the questions? Or you can take turns differently. Maybe Professor Robert Nerf may want to answer first, whoever comes first.
Yes, the question how the taxation works and how the old maxim, no taxation without representation, is practiced in Switzerland is really interesting because, of course, even in Switzerland, nobody likes to pay taxes. And it could be that it starts kind of a race to the bottom, that people just want lower taxes, but at the local level, they realize that without any taxes, there will be no public services at all. And this is one reason because people are able to optimize just to ask the question, should we have a new school building? It will cost more, we will have more taxes. But if we don't have more taxes, we don't have the new school building. The other reason that there is no complete race to the bottom, that people really don't like to pay taxes, but they are ready to pay taxes when they see that on the other side they get something for it. There is a second reason that it doesn't go really to the bottom. We have progressive taxation. So in fact, it's a minority of rich people who pay the majority of the taxes. So if you vote on the tax rate, you still have a majority who can make sure that they don't pay really much more, but that the minority of the rich have to pay more. And this prevents the system of going down to the zero taxation. And it works quite well. Of course, we have also big difference between poor jurisdictions, poor towns, poor villages, and we have also a system of recompensation. And this, in fact, spoils the complete competition. But maybe it's necessary. I'm not so much in favor. I would like to have more competition, but in fact, maybe it was wise just to introduce some recompensation system that is also a redistribution between relatively rich communities to relatively poor. It's a quite complicated system, but it works, maybe more or less. Maybe these are the most important questions that I tried to answer.
So maybe I can compliment first on the taxation system. This was asked as well. Yes, of course, in Germany we have as well a system to outbalance the strongest differences. So something like school education will always be guaranteed through a transfer mechanism between the different municipalities, but as well on a bigger level, which is a word monster like Länderfinanzausgleich, which is the equation between the different federal states. So the powerful states like Bavaria and Baden-Württemberg pay for the poorer states like Bremen or Schleswig-Holstein. And this guarantees at least something like the basic public services will be applied, but maybe the football stadium or so has to be closed down because there's no money left for this. There is some experimental experiences with public budget planning. This is not so much developed as it was, I think, 20 years ago in Brazil, in Porto Alegre. They had a decade or what with very public participation in local government. This is not the case, to my personal concern, in Germany. But of course, we see tendencies that more and more politics turn to policies. This is more flexible, this is more open. And there's one big issue behind this. Participation not necessarily means decision. So this has to be made clear that not just because I made myself heard, the decision will be taken due to my opinion, but this I made myself heard is already a big issue because everybody can express what he thinks about it. And this reflects as well something like priorities in economic development and growth, investments like, for it was said for Basilia, for Basel, when it comes to the acquisition of a Picasso painting. This participation and figuring out what are perspectives work very well when it comes to cluster, the formation of cluster, and as well when it comes to smart specialization strategies and what priorities have to be taken. And of course, when we started with all these exercises, it was everything had to go in because we wouldn't like to take priorities, which means inclusion, but at the same time exclusion. Yeah, you set priorities. This is fine for the parts where the priorities are set, but it's not so good for the parts that drop out of the scheme and they struggled as well. So this was a process of learning, of mutual learning. And I have to admit, there are so many programs that even for the, I don't want to call it losers, but for these sectors that are not on the first priorities, there are some possibilities to get some funding so they're not lost in space. And this comes as well to the question of regional disparities. Of course, normally when we talk about clusters, we address somehow economic powerful regions. There is the potential for 2 or 3 clusters as well. They can make up cross-cluster initiatives as well to boost all the potential. But of course, we have a lot of regions. There is no very prominent sector. There is no big company which could function as an anchor, and so on and so on. And for these regions, the cluster approach as it is doesn't work. So you have to start with something like binding together the little potential which does exist. You have to do very small steps. This is very something like low level. But of course, what is the alternative? Leave everybody as it is and do not have something like a plan how to develop the little economic potential you have. And maybe you have to complement with other means first. So to have something like a basic or good infrastructure, to have education system improved, to have something like access to needs of daily life, yeah, supermarkets or so on, something like very trivial things to make people stay in the region, to make people move to this region, to say, yes, I want to live here. And then if there's enough substance, you can go there, because we have a lot of regions which are very hardly hit by demographic change. These are something like the shrinking regions, and they have to stop firstly this process that everybody leaves the region. You have to give a perspective for the people, and then you can think of economic development. So it depends very much on regional level of development, and development is much more than economic development. You have to broaden up perspectives, and you have to think about the people who live there. It's not something like the primate only of economy, growth, but as well, perspective and quality of life are strong issues in this as well.
예, 마크
Thank you very much, Mr. Mark Borven-Schulte.
지금 시간이 약 8분 남았습니다.
We have about 8 minutes left, and I think we can have a general discussion as a way to wrap up. If you have a burning question or comment, please, the floor is yours.
자유롭게 우리 교수님들 말씀해 주시죠.
So I would like our discussants, if you have any burning comments or questions, this is the time to share them.
예.
How about we entertain questions from the floor?
방청하시면서 너무나 수고가 많으십니다.
We have participants here at the venue with us. I would like to take questions from the floor.
또 시키시면 안 해요.
I guess our participants a bit shy. Are there any questions from the floor?
예, 예, 예.
In that case, I will take the floor. Before we began the seminar, Dr. Christian Talks mentioned this. He talked about how local governments need to take center stage in the fourth industrial revolution. And he talked about the actors of decentralization and the revitalization of economies should be the local actors. And I think the four presentations direct us toward the path that we should take in the future. We talked about decentralization. In a more specific manner, we talked about the bicameral system. We talked about how to distribute financial resources and how we distribute roles and responsibilities. And we heard from Switzerland and Germany. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Lastly, because we are hosting this event in Chungju, maybe we'll hear from the Chungju councillor. This building is quite new, and it's an honor to be in this building, in this new building. The local autonomy will be implemented on January 23rd, but nothing's been prepared yet. Let's take a look at the number of people, the number of staff that we have has not changed. So when it comes to drafting legislatures, drafting policies, there's so much to do moving forward. And as a councilman of the city, I'm really honored that this grassroots democracy, this grassroots movement is actually happening as I am in this office. Although it's not going to be perfect in the beginning, I'm really happy to begin this implementation of local autonomy next year. And I heard many meaningful and useful presentations today, and I think it's going to help me prepare next year to execute local autonomy. And when it comes to improving the regional development and improving lives of our citizens, I think we are really working hard. Our council's really working hard to do that in our city. And it was really nice to listen to various opinions and presentations today. And I thought that I should do better as a councilman to further develop my city. Thank you. Thank you, Councilman.
Dr. Han, do you have any closing remarks? Do we have any other comments from the floor?
그러면은 또 말씀하신
Then
여러 교수님들이 안 계시므로
Since we do not have any further questions or comments, with that, I would like to conclude this international seminar. I would like to thank the hosts, the Center of Local Autonomy of Hanyang University, the Graduate School of Public Policy, the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom, Korea office, and the city of Chungju. I would like to thank you for putting together this seminar, and with that, I would like to conclude the seminar. Thank you very much. That wraps up this international seminar co-hosted by CLA, Hanyang University, Graduate School of Public Policy, Hanyang University, and FN of Korea, and Chungju City. Thank you very much.
감사합니다.